I started my hike early in the morning, before the sun had even risen over the ridge. The air was cool and damp, the kind of air that stuck in your throat and made each breath feel sharp. My backpack was heavy on my shoulders, but I had packed light compared to the way I usually over-prepared. Just the basics this time: water, food, first aid kit, flashlight, an extra layer, and a small tarp in case of rain. My plan was simple: follow the trail into the hills, loop around near the creek, then cut back before nightfall. I had done similar routes before, but this time I wanted to push further, deeper into the area where the map showed less detail, where the lines blurred between maintained trail and just wilderness. The trail started wide and clean, packed dirt that carried the marks of boots and the thin lines of bike tires. The trees on both sides were tall and close together, blocking most of the early light. The ground was soft from rain the night before, and my boots sank slightly with each step. Birds were starting to wake, their calls scattered and uneven, the forest still mostly quiet. I liked that silence, the kind that made you aware of how far you were from anything busy or loud. As I walked, the slope grew steeper and the trail narrowed. Roots cut across the ground like ropes, and rocks jutted out at strange angles, slick with moss. I moved slower, careful not to twist an ankle. The further I went, the less the trail looked used. Branches hung low, scratching across my arms and shoulders. Spider webs stretched across gaps, sticking to my face before I could brush them away. By mid-morning, I hadn't seen a single other person, which wasn't unusual, but it added to the sense that I was truly alone. Around noon, I stopped near a fallen tree to eat. I sat on the trunk, my back damp from sweat, and pulled out a sandwich and a bottle of water. While I ate, I studied the trees around me. They all seemed to lean in strange directions, bending slightly toward the trail, like they were pulled by something unseen. I shook it off as just my imagination and kept going, but the thought lingered. The trail cut into a slope where the ground on one side rose higher than my head, and the other side dropped off into a ravine. The dirt was loose here, and I had to plant each step carefully. My heart beat faster, not from the effort but from the feeling of how easy it would be to slip. My boots slid once, and a chunk of soil tumbled down into the ravine, bouncing off rocks before disappearing into the trees below. I stayed pressed against the wall of dirt, moving slow until the path widened again. By afternoon, clouds gathered overhead. They were thick and gray, blotting out the sun, and the light in the woods dimmed. I could hear wind moving through the higher branches, but down on the trail, the air was heavy and still. The silence grew deeper. No more bird calls, no more rustling of animals in the brush, just the sound of my boots on dirt and the faint rasp of my own breathing. When I reached the creek, the water was higher than I expected, rushing fast over rocks and fallen branches. The crossing point on the map was just a set of stepping stones, but they were slick and half-submerged now. I stood there for a long minute, weighing the risk. Finally, I decided to cross. I stepped carefully, one rock at a time, the water splashing over my boots. Halfway across, my foot slipped, and I dropped hard to one knee. Cold water surged into my boot, but I caught myself before falling completely. My heart pounded as I scrambled to the next rock, then the next until I made it across. My pants were wet, my socks soaked through, and the chill crawled up my leg. On the other side, the trail was harder to follow. It looked more like a game path than something made for people. I pushed through brush and ducked under branches, the map in my hand shaking slightly. The lines showed I was still on track, but it didn't feel like it. The air seemed heavier here, the trees thicker, the ground uneven. Every step felt like it took me deeper into a place people didn't belong. The first real sign that something was wrong came just before evening. I found a torn backpack lying half-buried in leaves beside the trail. It was faded and dirty, the fabric shredded along one side. The zippers were rusted, the straps frayed, and when I nudged it with my boot, it collapsed like it had been there for years. I bent down and pulled it open. Inside was nothing but damp leaves and dirt. No gear, no clue of who had left it. I set it back down, telling myself it was just lost, just abandoned, but the unease in my stomach grew sharper. I decided to turn back then, but when I checked my map, I realized I had already looped further than planned. The quickest way back was forward, not backtracking, so I kept going. The trail narrowed until it was barely more than a strip of trampled ground. Branches tore at my arms, my clothes snagged, and each step felt slower. The light was fading fast, and the clouds above threatened rain. By the time I stopped to set up camp, it was nearly dark. I found a small clearing just off the trail, barely wide enough for me to lay down my tarp. I spread it out, anchored the corners with rocks, and crawled underneath. The air smelled of damp earth and wet leaves. My clothes clung to me, cold against my skin. I ate a granola bar in silence, listening to the woods. That's when I heard it, the first sound that wasn't mine. A crunch, faint but sharp, like a footstep on dry leaves. My whole body froze. I held my breath, waiting. Another crunch, closer this time. I turned off my small flashlight, letting the darkness swallow me. I lay flat, heart hammering, ears straining. The sound came again, moving slow, circling the edge of the clearing. Could have been an animal, deer maybe, but it sounded too deliberate, too heavy, like someone putting weight down carefully. I stayed still, every muscle tight, until the sound faded into the trees. Minutes passed, maybe longer, before I let myself breathe again. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard movement. The crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig, faint breathing just beyond the tarp. When dawn finally came, gray light creeping through the trees, I packed up fast. My stomach twisted with hunger, but I couldn't eat. I just wanted to get out. The trail ahead was worse than before. Mud sucked at my boots, and the ground sloped unevenly. My legs ached. My wet sock rubbed my skin raw, and blisters burned with every step. I kept moving, checking the map again and again, but the lines didn't match what I saw. The trail forked where the map showed none. Paths curved away into the trees, each one looking worn enough to be real. I picked the one that felt right, but doubt gnawed at me with every step. Hours passed. The clouds never lifted, and the woods stayed dim. I didn't see a single marker, no signs, no cuts on trees, nothing to prove I was on the right track. The silence pressed down, heavier than before, broken only by my footsteps and the distant rush of water. When I stumbled into another clearing, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another backpack. This one newer, not torn, just dirty and soaked through. Beside it lay a boot, laces still tied. I stared at it, my throat dry, then forced myself to move on. I didn't want to know more. As the day dragged on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I felt eyes on me. I never saw anything, no movement, no shapes, but the sense was there, crawling up my neck. My nerves were shot, every sound twisting my stomach tighter. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. My legs shook with each step, and my head throbbed. I hadn't eaten more than a few bites all day. I told myself I just needed to keep moving, that the trail had to lead somewhere. But then I heard it again, the crunch of leaves. Slow, steady, matching my steps but just behind me. I spun around, but the trail was empty, just trees and shadows. My breathing turned ragged. I forced myself forward, faster, my heart pounding like it wanted to break free from my chest. The sound followed, sometimes faint, sometimes closer, but always there. I couldn't think straight anymore. Fear drowned out everything else. I left the trail, crashing through brush, desperate to throw off whatever was behind me. Branches whipped across my face, thorns tore my skin, but I didn't stop. I just kept running until my legs gave out and I fell hard against the ground. I lay there, gasping, my body shaking. The woods around me were silent again. No footsteps, no sound at all. Slowly, I pushed myself up and looked around. I had no idea where I was. The trail was gone, the map useless. All I saw were trees in every direction. Night fell while I wandered. I didn't stop this time, too afraid of what might come if I lay down. I stumbled through the dark, my flashlight beam bouncing off trees, shadows leaping with every step. My mind blurred from exhaustion, but I kept moving. The fear of stopping was worse than the pain. I had been planning that hike for weeks. It wasn't a special trail, not one of those places people dream about going to. It was just a stretch of rough country that I had marked out on a map, a mix of hills, thick woods, and a river that cut through a valley. The main reason I chose it was because it wasn't popular. I wanted quiet, the kind of quiet where the only thing you hear is your own footsteps and the sound of leaves moving in the wind. I had grown tired of trails where people stop every 5 minutes to take pictures. I wanted to be alone, to feel like I was really out there, away from everything. The first morning was nothing special. I parked my car on the side of a gravel road, shouldered my pack, and started moving. The ground was damp from rain the night before, and my boots sank slightly into the mud with each step. The air had that wet, earthy smell that comes after rain, heavy with the scent of pine. The sun was slow to burn through the low clouds, and everything felt gray, like the day hadn't fully woken up yet. I followed an old logging road for a while before cutting into the trees. The map showed no official trails in the area, just the river and some contour lines marking steep ridges. I had my compass, and I had the river as my main landmark. As long as I kept track of it, I wouldn't get lost. At least that was the plan. The woods closed around me quickly. Tall trees blocked most of the light, and the ground was a mess of roots, fallen branches, and slick patches of moss. Every now and then I'd step on something that gave way, and my heart would jolt as I stumbled. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. First, I liked it. No traffic, no voices, no noise but my own breath. But quiet like that has a way of making small sounds bigger. Every crack of a branch somewhere in the distance made me stop and look. Most of the time it was nothing, just a squirrel or a bird. But when you're alone in woods that thick, your mind doesn't always accept simple answers right away. Hours passed like that. I climbed ridges, slipped down muddy slopes, and worked my way toward where the river should have been. When I finally reached it, I was relieved. The water was fast, brown from the rain, with foam clinging to rocks. It looked stronger than I had expected. I sat on the bank, drank water, ate a little, and studied my map again. My plan was to follow the river north for a couple of miles before heading east toward a higher ridge where I'd camp for the night. The day dragged on. The sky stayed heavy and gray, never really brightening. I pushed through thickets that tore at my jacket, scrambled over slick rocks, and climbed through gullies where dead trees leaned like broken bones. It wasn't easy hiking. My legs burned, and my shoulders ached from the pack. Still, I kept moving, telling myself that the ridge would be worth it. From up there, I'd get a view of the valley, maybe even see far enough to spot the road I had left behind. By late afternoon, I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't say exactly why. The woods hadn't changed much, but something about the air felt different, heavier, like the quiet was pressing down harder. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, but there was never anyone there. I pushed the thought aside, telling myself I was just tired. I focused on reaching the ridge before dark. The slope was brutal, steep, muddy, and covered in loose rock that slid under my boots. I used my hands to grab roots and pull myself up. My pack felt like it weighed double. When I finally reached the top, I was breathing so hard it hurt. The view wasn't what I hoped for. The sky had darkened with thick clouds, and the forest below looked like a dark ocean of trees. No clearings, no sign of the road, nothing but endless green. The wind was stronger up there, colder too. I decided I had gone far enough for one day. I found a spot between two large rocks, dropped my pack, and started setting up my small tent. As I worked, I noticed something odd. There was a path, faint but there, leading past the rocks and into the trees. It wasn't an animal trail. The ground looked worn in a way that only happens from human feet. I hadn't seen any signs of people all day, no cabins, no cut stumps, nothing. Yet here was this narrow trail, hidden up on a ridge where there was no reason for one. I told myself it was probably old. Maybe loggers, maybe hunters. Still, it unsettled me. I pitched my tent facing away from it, not wanting to stare at that dark opening in the trees while I rested. The night was rough. The wind pushed against the nylon walls, and the trees groaned like old doors. I didn't sleep much. Every time I drifted off, some sounds snapped me back awake. A branch breaking, leaves crunching, things that were probably nothing but didn't feel like nothing in the dark. I lay there, heart pounding, waiting for morning. When the sky finally lightened, I was already packed. I wanted to get moving to put distance between myself and that ridge. I decided to head east, away from the river now, to loop back toward where I'd left my car. The woods only grew thicker. I hacked through brush, slipped into hollows, and pushed until sweat soaked my shirt. That was when I noticed something strange again. Another path, not as clear as the one on the ridge, but definitely there. Narrow, worn, and heading in the same general direction I was. I didn't want to follow it, but I kept crossing it as I moved. Eventually, it almost felt like the forest was pushing me onto it, guiding me whether I wanted it or not. The more I followed, the more wrong it felt. I started finding things. Old cans rusted into the dirt. A torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch. Once, a boot print, faint but still visible in the soft ground. Someone had been out here maybe not long ago. I told myself people come into the woods all the time. Hunters, campers, wanderers like me. But the farther I went, the more the unease grew. The trail twisted deeper into a section of forest where the trees grew so close together it felt like walls. The air was damp and sour, and light barely touched the ground. That was when I saw the first sign. It was just a tree, tall and wide, but carved into its bark was a mark. Not initials, not something casual. It looked like lines hacked with a knife, deep, angry cuts. I stopped and stared at it, and for a long moment I thought about turning back, but I didn't. I pushed on, telling myself I was overthinking. Then I found another, and another. More trees, each carved with marks. Some were just slashes, others more deliberate, almost like symbols. The air grew colder the farther I went, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. By afternoon, my nerves were shot. I decided to leave the trail behind and cut hard south, back toward the river. I thought if I hit the river, I could follow it back toward the road. It wouldn't be easy, but at least I'd know where I was. But the woods didn't let go. Every direction I tried, I kept running into more signs. More carved trees, more trash half buried in the ground. At one point, I found what looked like the frame of an old tent, collapsed and rotting into the dirt. Nearby, the ashes of a fire pit long dead. Whoever had been there, it wasn't recent, but it wasn't ancient either. The worst was what I found just before nightfall. I was stumbling through a dense patch of undergrowth when I broke into a small clearing. In the center of it was a pit. At first, I thought it was just a hole, maybe from a tree that had fallen long ago. But the sides were too neat, too cut. It was deep, dark, and wide enough that someone could easily fit inside. Around the edges, the dirt was stamped down like people had stood there often. I didn't go closer. Couldn't. My stomach turned, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. I backed out of the clearing, heart hammering, and moved until my legs nearly gave out. I set my tent up in a rush, not caring if the ground was level, not caring about food or water. I just wanted to crawl inside and shut it out. That night was worse than the first. The noises weren't just branches now. I heard movement, footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling. Once, something brushed against the side of the tent, and I stopped breathing until it was gone. I gripped the knife I carried, sweating, waiting for the fabric to tear open. But nothing happened. Somehow, I made it through until morning. When the sun came, I didn't bother packing everything. I shoved what I could into my pack and left the rest. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted out. I ran more than I walked, crashing through brush, scraping my arms and legs, following the compass with shaking hands. Hours later, when I finally stumbled out onto the gravel road where my car sat waiting, I nearly cried. I threw my pack in, started the engine, and drove without looking back. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Only then did I pull over, hands trembling on the wheel. I tried to tell myself I had imagined most of it, that I had just been tired, hungry, scared. But I couldn't shake the memory of that pit or the feeling of being watched all night. I never went back to that area. I don't even look at it on a map anymore. Some places aren't meant. I started the hike in the early morning, when the air was still damp and the ground carried the smell of wet soil from rain the night before. The trail was marked, but not one of the busy ones where people bring their families and dogs. This one was tucked deeper into the hills, the kind where you could walk for hours and not see another person if you timed it wrong. I had picked it on purpose. I wanted quiet, and I wanted to test myself on something longer and rougher than what I usually did. The pack on my back felt heavier than it should have, but I knew I had only put what I needed: water, some snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and an extra layer of clothes. I had read about the trail online and checked the map twice. It wound along a ridge and then cut into thick forest before dropping into a hollow that followed a creek. It was supposed to be about 10 miles round trip, but I had this thought in my head that maybe I could explore side paths, maybe push deeper if I felt strong. That thought stuck with me, and I realized later how stupid it was. The first couple of hours went smoothly. The forest was alive with sound. Birds starting up, the breeze pushing through the tops of the trees, the occasional crack of something shifting under the weight of the wind. The trail wasn't hard to follow at first. Clear dirt packed down by old boots, the occasional marker nailed to a tree. I kept a good pace and drank water every so often, trying not to get ahead of myself. By late morning, the sky had shifted. What had been blue and open when I started turned into this pale gray sheet that covered everything. The light grew flat, almost dull, and I noticed the woods felt different. Sound carried farther, and the air smelled heavy, like more rain was sitting out there somewhere, waiting. I kept walking because I thought it would pass. The trail dipped down into the hollow. It was steeper than I thought, slick from the earlier rain, and I had to steady myself more than once against trunks of trees. At the bottom, the creek ran faster than I expected, swollen with water. It cut the valley in half, and the trail followed alongside it. The air there was colder, darker. The canopy was so thick the daylight barely touched the ground. As I walked, I started noticing something that made me uneasy. The trail markers weren't showing up as often. At first, I shrugged it off, figuring the path was clear enough. But the deeper I went, the more the ground seemed torn up. Fallen branches crisscrossed the way, rocks jutted out, mud pooled in spots. It felt less like a trail and more like an animal track that had been trampled down once and never fixed. I kept telling myself I was fine, that if I just stayed close to the creek I couldn't get lost. The creek, after all, ran downhill and eventually it would lead somewhere. I walked another hour, maybe more, and that's when things started to shift from uncomfortable to something worse. The air grew heavier, so quiet that even the birds seemed gone. The only sound was water rushing against rocks. Then I saw it, the trail had split. One side veered uphill, narrow and tangled. The other kept close to the water. No marker, no sign. I stood there too long, trying to make sense of which way was right. Finally, I chose the water side, telling myself lower ground was safer. The decision cost me. The path began to fade fast. Roots twisted across it, brambles clawed at my legs, and every step felt like I was forcing my way where people hadn't gone in a long time. I kept pushing because the thought of turning back felt worse. I was sure I would see a marker soon, or at least some sign of where the trail picked up. But it never came. After another stretch, I realized I had lost it completely. There was no path anymore, just trees closing in, the creek roaring beside me, and the sinking feeling in my stomach that I was deeper in than I thought. I stopped to breathe, trying to get control of the panic rising up. I pulled the map from my pack, but standing there in the woods, it didn't mean much. The paper lines and circles didn't match the mess around me. The compass helped a little. I knew the trail was supposed to loop east, but when I looked through the trees, every direction looked the same. That's when I heard the first sound that wasn't the creek. It was sharp, sudden, like something heavy stepping on a branch. I froze. My eyes darted through the trees, waiting for movement, but there was nothing. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe even a branch breaking on its own. But the way it cracked, it felt close, too close. I started walking again, faster now, my boots sinking into soft ground. The forest seemed to tighten the deeper I went. The underbrush grabbed at me, branches whipped across my arms, and sweat started to roll down my back even though the air was cool. Every so often, I heard more sounds behind me. Snaps, the shuffle of something moving, the kind of noise that didn't repeat like an animal grazing, but stopped when I stopped. That's when fear really set in. I didn't turn around. I just kept moving, forcing myself forward, trying to keep the creek in sight so I wouldn't lose all sense of direction. My legs burned, my throat felt dry, and the strap of my pack dug hard into my shoulders. Time blurred. I don't know how long I kept at it, but it felt endless. At one point, I broke into a small clearing. The ground there was torn up, mud churned like something big had passed through. There were prints too, deep ones pressed into the wet ground, not boots but something wider. They weren't clear enough to know what animal made them, but they were fresh. I didn't linger. By now, the sky was darker, heavy clouds stacked overhead. The first drops of rain hit as I stumbled onto a slope. I pushed upward, slipping on the wet earth, grabbing roots to pull myself along. My arms shook with effort, my lungs screaming for air. At the top, I found nothing but more trees. No trail, no sign of anything human. The rain came harder, steady sheets that blurred the forest. My clothes clung to me, cold and heavy. I knew I had to make some kind of shelter before it got worse. I found a cluster of rocks and wedged myself against them, pulling my pack over my chest. My hands shook as I dug out the extra layer, pulling it on even though it was damp. I chewed a piece of granola, but it felt like sawdust in my mouth. I sat there, listening. The rain masked everything, but every so often, I thought I heard movement beyond it. Not close, not loud, but there. I kept my flashlight in my hand, thumb against the switch, even though I knew using it too early would drain the batteries. When night came, it was sudden. The forest swallowed what little light was left, leaving me in near blackness. I clicked the flashlight on, the narrow beam cutting through mist and rain. Every tree it touched looked like a figure. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Couldn't sleep. I just sat there, waiting, counting the hours by the dimming of the beam. At some point deep in the night, I heard it again, the snap of branches, heavier this time, closer. I swung the light, hands trembling, but saw nothing. The sound stopped again the moment I moved. That was worse than if I'd seen something. It meant whatever it was knew I was there, watching. By morning, the rain had slowed, but fog blanketed everything. My clothes were soaked through, my pack heavier than ever. I forced myself up, muscles stiff, body aching. I decided to head east no matter what, just keep moving in one direction until I hit something, a road, a sign, anything. The forest fought me every step. Thorns tore at my legs, mud tried to suck my boots off, and the creek I followed veered away until I couldn't hear it anymore. I thought about shouting, but the sound died in my throat. Out there, shouting felt like asking for the wrong thing to answer. Hours passed. Hunger gnawed at me, thirst worse. I rationed the last of my water, forcing slow sips. The noises kept coming, not constant but enough. Branches cracking, leaves shifting, the sense that something trailed me just out of sight. Then I saw it, a scrap of color against the trees. At first, I thought it was another trick of the light, but when I pushed closer, I saw it was fabric. Red, torn, tangled on a branch. Not new, weathered, faded, but human. A shirt maybe shredded and left hanging. That chilled me more than anything. It meant someone else had been lost out here, maybe worse. I dropped it and kept moving, my chest tight with panic. Every sound around me felt sharper, closer, the forest pressing in. By late afternoon, I stumbled onto something that didn't belong. A fence, rusted and half collapsed, cutting through the trees. I almost cried when I saw it. Fence meant property, property meant people. I followed it, pushing through brush until it led to a break where an old logging road cut across. The sight of tire tracks in the mud was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I walked that road until my legs barely held me. Finally, it spilled onto gravel and then to a paved road. I collapsed at the edge, soaked, shaking, but alive. I don't remember much after that except headlights, someone slowing down, a door opening. I had made it out. But even now, when I think back, what stays with me isn't the rain, or the hunger, or even being lost. It's the sound of something moving just. I always liked hiking alone. Some people said it was risky, others thought it was boring without company. But for me, it was the only time I felt clear-headed. No phone ringing, no noise of traffic, no endless things pulling at me. Just my boots on the ground, the smell of dirt and pine, the sharp air filling my chest. That morning I set out earlier than usual because I wanted to try a new trail. It wasn't one of the popular ones with the wide gravel paths and wooden signs every few steps. This one was narrow, barely marked, and I had found it on an old forum where a guy mentioned it being quiet and less crowded. That was exactly what I wanted. I parked my car on the shoulder of a small forest road. There was only enough space for 2 vehicles, but mine was the only one there. That gave me a good feeling. It meant I wouldn't run into groups of noisy hikers. I locked up, strapped on my pack, and headed into the trees. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Even birdsong seemed thinner here, like the forest was heavy and holding its breath. The ground was damp from rain the night before, and each step made a faint sucking sound. My boots sank just slightly into the soft dirt, and I could smell the wet leaves rotting in patches along the slope. The trail climbed fast, sharper than I expected, and soon my legs burned a little. I didn't mind the effort, though. I liked the way hiking made you aware of every part of your body. The ache in your calves, the stretch in your back, the thud of your heart pulled you into the moment. I kept going, pushing through branches that clawed at my jacket, listening to the faint rustle of squirrels moving through the undergrowth. After maybe an hour, I noticed how narrow the trail had become. In some places, it was nothing more than a faint line of pressed dirt, sometimes broken by roots and rocks. I had to keep looking down to make sure I didn't twist an ankle. A couple of times I paused and looked back, but the trail behind me already seemed half erased by shadows and brush. It struck me that if I lost it completely, I might have trouble finding my way back. I told myself to pay more attention. Around midday, I stopped to rest on a flat boulder. I took off my pack, drank from my bottle, and chewed on a protein bar. My shirt clung damp to my skin from sweat, and a cool breeze slid through the trees, raising goosebumps along my arms. I sat listening to the creaks and distant cracks of the forest settling, but what bothered me was the silence of people. I realized I hadn't heard or seen a single other hiker, not one. On the busier trails, you'd always hear voices somewhere in the distance, the clink of trekking poles, laughter carried by the wind. But here, nothing. I started moving again, deeper in. The trees grew taller, straighter, and closer together, like the forest was tightening its grip. My GPS app still showed me on the path, but the signal flickered sometimes. I didn't like that. I kept walking, telling myself I would turn around in another hour. Then I saw it. At first it looked like a pile of brush off to the right of the trail, but when I got closer, I realized it was something else. Branches had been leaned together into a kind of rough shelter, low and triangular, like a crude teepee. The wood was old, gray with age, and moss clung to some of the poles. I crouched to peer inside. The space was small, barely big enough for one person to curl up in, and the dirt inside looked pressed down like someone had once slept there. What unsettled me was how far it was from any normal campsite. No fire ring, no trash, nothing left behind. Just the shelter itself, as if whoever built it had done so with care not to leave a trace. I backed away from it and kept walking, but I couldn't shake the image from my mind. Someone had been here before me, and it wasn't some casual hiker who needed a break. It felt deliberate, hidden. The trail dipped into a gully, damp and filled with ferns, before climbing again. The climb was steep, and when I reached the top, I felt a sudden rush of relief because I could see farther ahead. But that relief vanished when I noticed something caught on a branch just off the trail. It was a piece of cloth, a torn scrap of faded blue, hanging from a thorn. I pulled it free. The edges were frayed and dirty, and it smelled faintly sour, like sweat soaked into fabric for too long. I dropped it and kept moving faster, suddenly aware of how quiet the woods had become again. Not long after, I came across something that made me stop cold. The dirt ahead of me was disturbed, not by animals, but by footprints. Human ones. They were uneven, messy, like whoever made them had been dragging their feet. Some prints pressed deep, others barely marked the soil, but they all moved in the same direction I was going. I hesitated. My first thought was to turn back immediately, but then I reasoned with myself these could be old. Days old, weeks even. The rain from last night hadn't washed them away because of the thick tree cover. That was possible. I convinced myself it was nothing, but the deeper I went, the stranger the forest felt. I noticed dead trees hacked roughly with a blade, bark stripped in chunks. I noticed bones, small ones maybe from a rabbit, scattered near a stump. The air grew heavier, damper until my shirt stuck to me again. By late afternoon, the light began to fade faster than I expected. The trees were thick overhead, blocking out the sun. I knew I should turn back, but something about following the trail felt like being caught on a hook. I told myself I would go just a little further, then head back quickly before dark. That's when I found the clearing. It was small, maybe 20 feet across, surrounded by dense trees. The ground was packed dirt, bare of plants, and in the center stood something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a wooden frame, lashed together with rope, about the size of a table. On top of it lay more bones. Not just animal bones this time. These were larger. A femur, unmistakably human. A skull cracked down one side. My stomach flipped, and I staggered back, my mouth dry, my throat tight. I didn't think. I just turned and ran. My pack slammed against my back as I barreled down the trail, branches tearing at me, roots trying to catch my boots. I didn't care if I twisted an ankle or ripped my jacket. I just ran. At one point, I thought I heard something behind me, a snapping branch, a fast shuffle. I didn't look, couldn't. My chest burned, my lungs screamed, but I kept moving until my legs nearly gave out. Finally, through the blur of panic, I spotted something familiar, the boulder I had rested on earlier. Relief hit me like a drug. I dropped beside it, trying to catch my breath, fighting the urge to vomit. The forest around me was silent, too silent. I forced myself up and pushed on, retracing my steps as best as I could. My GPS flickered again, but this time it didn't matter. I knew I had to keep moving, to get out before dark swallowed everything. The last stretch felt endless. My body shook from exhaustion and fear, every shadow a threat, every rustle in the undergrowth a warning. By the time I stumbled out of the trees and saw my car, I nearly collapsed. I yanked open the door, threw my pack inside, and slid behind the wheel. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. When the engine finally started, the sound felt unreal, too loud, almost fragile against the weight of the forest pressing behind me. I drove away fast, not daring to look in the mirror, not daring to stop until the road widened and I saw other cars, other people. Only then did I pull over and sit in the driver's seat, gasping for air, staring at my trembling hands on the wheel. I never told anyone what I found. Not the shelter, not the footprints, not the clearing with the bones. Part of me wanted to, but another part of me knew I couldn't explain it without sounding insane. And I didn't want to go back there with strangers in uniforms, pointing at the ground and asking me to lead them deeper into that place. Instead, I kept it inside, but it changed me. Every time I hike now, I stay on the busy trails, the ones with signs and chatter and the sound of dogs barking. I never go off on the narrow paths again, never chase the quiet, because I know what waits in the quiet, and I know I barely got out of it. I had been hiking for years, mostly on marked trails near towns, the kind that had signs, benches, and other hikers passing by every half hour. But that summer, I wanted something different. I wanted to go somewhere I would not see anyone, somewhere that would test me, somewhere raw. I had read about a long trail that cut deep into the forest of a mountain range that wasn't too far from where I lived. It was not a famous trail. It wasn't one of those spots people posted about online with pictures of waterfalls and fire lookouts. This one was quiet, unmarked in many areas, and according to a short article I found, rarely maintained. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my bag for a 3-day hike. I carried a tent, sleeping bag, food packed in zip bags, water filter, flashlight, extra batteries, knife, first aid kit, and spare clothes. I checked everything twice. I had hiked enough to know small mistakes can ruin trips. My plan was to park my car at a small dirt lot at the edge of the forest, hike in until late afternoon, set up camp, hike more the next day, then circle back on the 3rd. I had a map, but it was old and faded, one of those folded paper maps you can barely read when the light is low. I had no signal out there, so I had to trust it and my compass. The morning I left was warm, and the sun was sharp, but the forest swallowed most of that brightness. The trail was narrow, made mostly from soil that had been pressed down by boots and animals. At first it felt easy. Birds moved from branch to branch, insects buzzed around, and I walked steadily. But as I got deeper in, the trail became less clear. Roots crossed the path, thorn bushes forced me to push my arms through, and I started to notice how silent it was compared to the beginning. That silence felt heavy. By noon, I was sweating hard. My shirt was soaked down my back, and I had already drained most of a liter of water. I stopped on a flat rock, pulled off my pack, and ate some trail mix. My legs were shaking a little from the weight of the pack. I looked around. The forest there was different. The trees were tall, thin, with bark peeling off like dead skin. They grew so close together that in some spots you could barely see past them. When I started walking again, I noticed something that made me uneasy. The trail split into 2 faint tracks. One veered left, sloping slightly down into darker woods. The other climbed gently upward, though the ground looked rough. My map didn't show any split here. It just marked one thin line. I stared at both paths for a while. The upward one looked more like the kind of path hikers would use. The other seemed more like an animal track. I chose upward. After another 2 hours, I realized I hadn't seen any trail markers or signs for a long time. Usually there are colored blazes on trees or small wooden posts stuck in the ground. Here there was nothing. The path I followed was faint, almost swallowed by roots and fallen branches. Still, I kept going. The air smelled damp, earthy, like rot. I kept checking my map, trying to line up the small bends with the streams drawn on paper, but nothing matched perfectly. By late afternoon, the forest pressed in tighter. It was hard to see far in any direction. The ground sloped downward into a ravine, and the trail disappeared under leaves. I pulled out my compass and tried to stay steady, heading southwest, which was the direction the map showed toward a small lake where I thought I could camp. The slope was steep, and I had to grip trees as I moved down. My boots slipped on wet soil more than once. When I reached the bottom of the ravine, I expected to find a stream. The map showed one there, but all I found was a dry bed filled with rocks. That was the first time I really felt worry. My water was running low. I decided to keep walking west until I found water, but the forest was messy, tangled with fallen logs, thorn bushes, and sharp stones. I walked for another hour before I finally heard the sound of water. I pushed through brush and found a narrow creek flowing between stones. Relief washed over me. I filled my bottle and used my filter. As I knelt there, I had the strange sense of being watched. The hair on my neck stood up. I turned around slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, just the silence, thick and heavy. It was almost evening. I didn't want to keep moving in the dark, so I chose a spot near the creek where the ground was flat enough for my tent. I set it up quickly, then gathered sticks for a small fire. The wood was damp, but after struggling with my lighter, I got a small flame going. I sat by the fire, ate a bag of dried noodles, and listened. Normally, at night in the forest, there are sounds. Frogs, crickets, owls, but here, nothing. The silence was absolute. I tried to ignore it, crawled into my tent, and lay down. My body was tired, but my mind was awake. Hours seemed to pass. Then I heard something. A snap of a branch, heavy, like weight pressing down. Not the light crack of a squirrel, but something larger. My stomach tightened. I held my breath and listened. Another snap, then silence. I thought about grabbing my knife, but I forced myself to stay still. Eventually, I fell into a shallow sleep. When I woke, the fire had burned down to ash. The forest was dark, colder than I expected. I stepped out to relieve myself and noticed something that froze me in place. On the ground, about 15 feet from my tent, was a mark, a shoe print, not mine. It was fresh, pressed deep into the soil. I stood there staring at it for what felt like a long time. My chest tightened. I looked around, scanning every tree, every shadow. I saw no one, but the idea that someone had been standing that close to my tent while I slept made my skin crawl. I packed my things fast that morning. I didn't even eat breakfast. I decided to cut my trip short. I would try to circle back toward the main trail and leave. I thought about the shoe print the entire time I walked. It wasn't small, not a child's, and it wasn't old. Whoever made it had been there recently, maybe during the night. As I moved, I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest made everything look the same. Trees repeated the same patterns, the ground had no clear trail, and I kept second-guessing myself. I used the compass, but the terrain forced me off course. Hours passed. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and I was sweating through my shirt again. Around noon, I stumbled into a clearing. At first, I thought I was lucky. Clearings sometimes mean old logging roads or paths, but this one was strange. The ground was flattened, not by machines, but by use. In the center was a fire pit, blackened with ash. Around it were shapes, wooden poles stuck into the ground, tied together with rope at odd angles. Some looked like tripods, others like crude frames. On one frame hung strips of cloth, faded and torn, moving slightly in the breeze. I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't just some old campsite. It looked deliberate but wrong. The ropes were weathered but not rotting. The fire pit looked used recently. I walked around it slowly, careful not to step too close. I noticed bones near the pit, small, maybe animal, cracked open as if for marrow. I backed away and turned to leave, but as I stepped out of the clearing, I noticed another shoe print in the soil, pointed in the same direction I was walking. My pace quickened. I didn't stop again until late afternoon. My feet were blistered, my calves burning. I found a small slope where I sat and forced myself to drink water and eat. My hands were shaking so bad I spilled half the food on the ground. Every sound in the forest felt sharper now. Every rustle made me look over my shoulder. That night, I didn't make a fire. I didn't set up my tent either. I just laid my sleeping bag under thick brush to hide myself. I barely slept, every noise keeping me awake. Twice I swore I heard footsteps moving slowly through the leaves, stopping, then moving again. The next morning, I pushed harder, desperate to find a marked trail or anything that would lead me out. My map was useless now. Nothing matched. The land dipped and rose in ways I couldn't trace. I stumbled more than once, catching myself on trees, scraping my arms. By midday, I came across something that made my heart pound harder than anything else I had seen. A backpack. It was old, lying against a tree, straps torn. I crouched down and looked at it. Inside were scraps of clothing, moldy food wrappers, and a water bottle cracked at the top. The backpack was covered in dirt, but it hadn't been there for years, maybe months. I left it there. I didn't want to touch it. I just kept walking, faster now, almost running. My legs screamed, but fear pushed me. The forest never seemed to end. Every time I thought I saw light ahead, it was just more trees. My mind started to play tricks on me. I thought I heard whispers, but when I stopped, it was just wind. My stomach hurt from hunger, but I didn't want to stop to eat. By late afternoon, I finally found something that gave me hope. A wooden post, faded and chipped, sticking out of the ground with a faint red paint mark on it. A trail marker. Relief washed over me so I had been planning that hike for weeks. The trail wasn't famous, not the kind of place you saw in brochures or travel blogs. It was tucked away in a remote part of the mountains, a narrow line on the map that most people never noticed. I found it one evening while scrolling through old hiking forums, where some hiker mentioned it in passing, calling it random and rough. That word stuck with me. Random. It felt like something that wasn't supposed to matter, but it pulled me in anyway. I wanted something unpolished, something that didn't have signs every half mile and benches to rest on. I wanted the kind of trail that felt forgotten, the kind that pushed you harder than you thought you could go. I packed my bag carefully the night before. I put in 2 water bottles, a small filter pump, some dried food, an extra jacket, a headlamp, a lighter, and my knife. I always carried that knife even though I hardly used it, more for peace of mind than anything else. I laid out my boots by the door, double-checked my socks, and set the alarm for early morning. The weather report said it would be clear all day, cool in the morning, and warmer by noon. Perfect conditions. I fell asleep thinking about ridgelines and tree lines, about pushing through that quiet space where all you could hear was your own breath and the sound of dirt under your shoes. When I woke up, it was still dark. I ate a quick breakfast, grabbed my pack, and drove out to the base of the mountain. The parking area wasn't marked, just a wide patch of gravel with enough space for maybe 4 cars. Mine was the only one there. That gave me a strange mix of excitement and unease. I liked the idea of having the whole trail to myself, but there was also something heavy about standing there alone. No sound of people, no other cars, nothing. Just me and the trees. The first mile was calm. The ground was damp from rain the day before, and my boots made soft prints in the mud. The trail was narrow and uneven, lined with roots that twisted out from the dirt. The air smelled of wet leaves and pine. Sunlight was just beginning to filter through the trees, turning the mist into pale ribbons that stretched between trunks. I felt good, my legs strong, my breathing steady. I thought about how long I would go, maybe 7 miles up, then back down before dark. That seemed fair. I had all day, but the trail didn't stay simple for long. After the first mile, it began to climb steeply. The dirt turned into loose rock, and the trees thinned. I could hear water somewhere close, the rush of a creek hidden below the slope. The ground was slippery, and more than once I had to grab branches to keep from sliding back. My heart was working harder, my shirt sticking to my back. I kept pushing upward, telling myself the view at the top would make it worth it. By the 3rd mile, the forest closed in again. The trail became harder to see. It split in places where deer tracks cut across, and I had to stop often to be sure I was on the right line. There were no signs, no blazes painted on the trees, nothing to guide me. I started marking the bark with my knife as I passed, just in case I needed to find my way back. It wasn't something I usually did, but I felt uneasy, like the trail could vanish if I stopped paying attention. The silence was heavy too. In most woods you hear birds, insects, wind moving branches. Here there was almost nothing, just the crunch of my boots and the rasp of my breath. Every time I stopped, the quiet pressed in. It made me feel exposed, like the trees themselves were watching. I told myself it was only because I was alone and unused to such deep stillness. But that didn't shake the feeling. By noon, I was high on the ridge. I found a flat rock and sat down to eat. My legs burned, and my throat was dry. I chewed slowly, looking out at the slope falling away beneath me. The forest spread for miles, a green ocean with no sign of people. No houses, no roads, nothing. Just endless trees. For a moment, it was beautiful, peaceful even. But then another thought slid in, sharper. If something went wrong here, no one would know. No one would even hear me shout. I pushed that thought away and got moving again. The trail narrowed as it followed the ridge. On one side, the slope fell sharply down. On the other, it rose into broken rock and thick brush. I kept my steps careful. The air grew cooler, and clouds drifted overhead, dimming the light. My sense of time slipped. Each step felt slower, heavier. I checked my watch and realized more hours had passed than I thought. That unsettled me too. The day was moving faster than I was. Somewhere around mile 6, I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. A tree had fallen across the path, but not in a natural way. It wasn't old or rotted. It looked cut. The trunk was clean, almost flat, like it had been taken down with a saw. but the cut was angled and rough, not like the clean lines of a chainsaw. Maybe an axe. The tree had been dragged slightly, blocking the path completely. I had to climb over it. My hands came away sticky with sap. I looked around but saw nothing. No stump nearby, no sign of firewood, no camp, just the tree. It unsettled me, but I told myself it could have been some hunter or woodcutter passing through months earlier. Still, after that point, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Every crack of a branch behind me made me glance over my shoulder. Every rustle in the brush set my nerves on edge. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It felt weighted, like something was in it, something just out of sight. By late afternoon, the trail started to fade. It grew faint, overgrown, less like a path and more like a suggestion. I slowed, checking the ground for prints, anything that showed I was still on the right track. That's when I found the boot prints. They were fresh. The edges were sharp, not softened by rain or wind, and they weren't mine. They were larger, deeper. Someone had come through recently, maybe today. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach twisting. Could mean another hiker. Sure, but why had I seen no one else? No cars at the base, no voices, nothing. The prints bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I kept going, but now I couldn't relax. My eyes darted between the trees, my ears straining for sound. I moved slower, quieter, as if I didn't want to be heard. My own paranoia began to build against me. Every shadow looked like movement. Every bend in the trail felt like it was hiding something. My breathing turned shallow. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was never anything. The trail finally ended at a clearing near the top of the ridge. It wasn't a smooth meadow or a scenic overlook. It was rough ground, full of weeds and rocks. In the middle of it sat an old fire ring, stones blackened with soot. There were bones too, scattered in the grass. Small ones, maybe from deer or rabbits, but broken, splintered. Some looked newer than others. I stood there for a long time, gripping my pack straps, feeling the cold crawl over my skin. Whoever left those prints had been here, maybe not long ago. I decided to turn back. I had gone far enough, and the sun was already dropping. The ridge was shadowed, the sky pale above it. I didn't want to be caught here in the dark. I started down fast, retracing my steps, keeping my eyes on the marks I had carved into the trees. I thought I would feel relief moving back toward the car, but instead the tension grew. Every step down made me feel more certain I was being followed. I never saw anyone, never heard anyone, but the sense of it was there, gnawing at me, making the hair on my neck stand up. The woods darkened fast, shadows stretched long, and the trail turned harder to read. I pulled out my headlamp, but I didn't turn it on yet. I didn't want to draw attention. That was the thought in my head, and it chilled me even more because I couldn't explain it. Attention from who? From what? But I couldn't shake it. At one point, I heard a sound behind me. Not a branch breaking, not an animal moving. A step, a human step on rock. I froze, holding my breath, my chest tight. The forest went still. I waited, eyes locked on the shadows behind me. Nothing moved. I forced myself forward, faster this time, almost running, my heart hammering. I didn't look back again. By the time I reached the lower miles, night had fallen. I had no choice but to switch on the headlamp. The beam cut a narrow tunnel through the dark, and the rest of the forest closed in tight around it. The silence pressed harder, thicker, broken only by my breath and the crunch of my boots. I felt hunted, though I saw nothing. My thoughts spiraled. What if someone lived out here? Someone who didn't want to be found? What if I had walked into their space without knowing? The cut tree, the boot prints, the bones, it all spun in my head. When I finally reached the parking area, I nearly collapsed with relief. But my relief lasted only a second, because when I stepped out of the trees, I saw another car parked next to mine. It hadn't been there that morning. It was an old sedan, mud spattered, with no plates on the front and a dark tint. I decided to go hiking on a late summer morning. I had been stuck indoors for weeks, buried in work, and my head felt heavy. I wanted quiet, open air, and the rough ground under my feet. I picked a trail I didn't know much about, just something random that I had seen on a map. It wasn't one of the busy ones, not the kind with a visitor center or dozens of cars lined up at the entrance. It was tucked away a little deeper, with a single gravel lot and no signs except for a wooden post with the trail name carved into it. That was what I wanted, something empty, away from people. The morning was clear, the kind of morning where the sun came in sharp through the trees, making long stripes on the dirt road as I drove. My pack was light, just water, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and some snacks. I told myself I'd only be out a few hours, back before dark. The lot was empty when I pulled in. My car looked small under the tall trees that closed in on the gravel. I cut the engine, and the silence hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't the kind of silence you get in a city or even in a park. It was thick, full of the weight of trees and distance, the sort of silence where you realize how far away you are from anyone else. I started walking. The trail began wide and easy, packed dirt with the marks of tires and boots. Birds flicked through the branches above, and the air smelled of pine and wet soil. I felt good, strong, even pushing forward with a steady rhythm. But the deeper I went, the more the trail narrowed. The light grew dimmer as the trees closed in, and the ground grew rough, tangled with roots and scattered rocks. My footsteps seemed louder, crunching over leaves, snapping small twigs. I stopped a few times just to listen, and each time I felt something strange. The kind of awareness that creeps in when you realize how alone you are. About an hour in, I came to a fork. There was no sign, just one path bending left and another right. The left path looked a little more worn, with a faint line of dirt showing through leaves. The right looked almost forgotten, overgrown and faint. I hesitated but chose the right. I told myself it would be more interesting, less traveled, the kind of route where I could feel like I was really exploring. The air seemed cooler as I stepped into it, and the canopy thickened overhead. As I moved along, the ground grew uneven, sloping downward in patches, climbing back up sharply in others. I noticed small things that stuck in my mind more than they should have. A tree with its bark stripped clean in long claw-like lines. A patch of ground torn up, as if something had dug deep into the dirt. I tried to brush it off. Animals, I thought, nothing unusual, but I kept noticing more. A pile of feathers scattered in a circle. A smell, faint but sour, drifting through the air for a moment before vanishing. I drank some water, pushed on, and tried to enjoy the quiet, but the quiet began to feel different. It wasn't restful anymore. It was heavy, almost pressing. The birdsong I had heard earlier was gone. The wind, too, had dropped away, leaving the trees stiff and still. Every time I shifted my pack or adjusted my footing, the noise seemed too loud. At one point, I heard something behind me, just a snap of a branch, sharp and clean. I froze, listening. Nothing followed. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. They stood silent, unmoving, their shadows long and tangled. I waited, holding my breath, then told myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, or even a squirrel. I moved on, but my steps were slower now, my eyes flicking back more often than before. The trail thinned further, dropping into a gully lined with ferns. The ground was damp, soft underfoot. My boots sank slightly with each step, making wet sucking sounds. As I reached the bottom, I noticed something odd. A shoe, just one, half buried in mud, its fabric torn and faded. It looked old, weathered by rain and dirt, but it was unmistakably a hiking shoe. I stared at it for a long moment, then moved on quickly, telling myself things get left behind all the time. Climbing out of the gully took more effort. The slope was steep, and I had to grab roots and rocks to pull myself up. My arms and legs burned, and sweat ran down my back. When I reached the top, I stopped to catch my breath. That was when I heard it again, movement behind me. Not just a single crack this time, but something heavier, like weight pressing on leaves and snapping twigs. I spun around fast, but again, nothing. Only trees, stretching tall and endless. My heart was beating faster than it should have been, and I could feel the sweat cooling on my skin. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was just on edge, that being alone was making every sound seem bigger. I kept walking, but now every step felt like I was pushing into something I shouldn't. The trail was barely a trail anymore, just faint patches where the ground dipped or the grass lay flat. I started to wonder if I had made a mistake taking this route. My phone had no signal. The thought of how far I had come hit me harder than before. After another stretch, I came to a small clearing. In the middle was something that stopped me cold. A fire ring. Stones arranged in a circle, blackened in the center from old ash. Around it were scraps of trash, an empty can, a torn plastic wrapper, a bent fork. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't ancient either. People had been here, maybe not long ago. For a second, I felt relief. Then it turned to unease. Whoever had been here hadn't used the main trail. They had come out here the same way I had, following this nearly invisible path. And they had stayed. I looked around the clearing, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The longer I stood, the stronger it got, until I felt like the trees themselves were leaning toward me. I left fast, pushing back onto the faint trail and moving quicker than before. My legs ached, but I didn't care. It wasn't long before the trail simply ended. The ground ahead was wild, tangled with brush and fallen logs. I stood there, trying to decide whether to push through or turn back. I hated the thought of retracing all those miles, but pushing forward blind didn't feel smart either. I stood still, weighing my choices, when I heard it again. Movement. This time it was clear, steady, and close. Something was moving in the trees to my left, matching my stillness with its own. I forced myself to look, scanning between the trunks. For a moment, I thought I saw something pale. Not clothing, not bright, just a shift of color where there shouldn't have been one. My stomach tightened, and the hairs on my arms rose. I backed up a step, then another. The woods stayed quiet, but I knew I wasn't alone. I turned and started back the way I came, walking fast but trying not to break into a run. My eyes kept sweeping the sides, searching for movement. Every sound now seemed too sharp, too close. Branches snapped behind me more than once, and each time I froze, listening, then pushed forward harder. The forest, which had seemed peaceful that morning, now felt like a cage. The trees pressed in, the ground twisted under my feet, and the silence broke again and again with sounds I didn't make. When I reached the clearing with the fire ring again, the feeling hit me hardest. The trash, the stones, the blackened ash. It all seemed wrong now, as if it was watching me in its own way. I didn't stop this time. I pushed through as fast as I could, my pack bumping against my back, my throat dry no matter how much water I drank. The gully came next. Going down was faster, but climbing out nearly broke me. My legs shook, my arms burned, and all the while I felt it. Something following, something just out of sight. When I pulled myself to the top, I didn't even pause. I kept moving, stumbling at times, barely catching myself. The sun was lower now. The light through the trees was dimmer, stretched long across the ground. Shadows thickened, and the air grew cooler. I wanted out. I wanted the gravel lot, my car, the road, the noise of the engine. But the trail felt longer now, stretched somehow, each bend leading only to more trees. Then I saw it. Another shoe. Not the same one as before. This one was newer, lying on its side near the edge of the path. I didn't stop. I didn't even look closely. I pushed past it, my chest tight, my breath ragged. The sounds behind me grew bolder. No more single snaps or faint shifts. It was weight moving through brush, keeping pace. I wanted to run, but the trail was rough, full of roots and rocks. If I fell, if I twisted an ankle, I knew I wouldn't get back up. So I forced myself to keep the pace. Fast, steady, but not reckless. Finally, the trees began to thin. The ground widened, the trail grew clearer. I could see patches of sky, dimming now with the late hour. My legs felt like lead, my lungs burned, but I kept going until I saw it. The gravel lot, my car waiting alone in the fading light. I woke up earlier than usual that morning because I wanted to make the most out of the day. The night before, I had studied the map on my phone and planned a hiking route through a section of forest I had never been to before. It was one of those areas that looked quiet on the satellite view. No towns nearby, just endless green with winding rivers and ridges that stretched out like ribs. I wanted solitude, a long trail, and the chance to push myself further than I normally did. I packed light but careful, bringing water, some trail mix, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a folding knife. I left my car in a gravel turnout near the treeline, locked it, slung my pack over my shoulders, and stepped into the woods. The trail started easy, wide enough that two people could walk side by side. The morning air was cool, and I could still see mist rising off the damp soil. The birds were active, filling the air with sharp whistles and low coos. The forest was thick, the trees close enough that little light reached the ground. But here and there were clearings filled with waist-high ferns. I walked at a steady pace, feeling good, letting my legs warm up. My boots pressed down on the damp earth, leaving clear prints, and I liked seeing them when I looked back, knowing that was my way out later. After the first hour, I started seeing less sign of people. The trail narrowed, roots cut across it, and the branches overhead tangled together. Spider webs stretched between the trees, and more than once I had to wave them off my face. I stopped to drink water, standing still while the forest sounds changed. I noticed that when I didn't move, everything else became louder. The tapping of a woodpecker, the rustling of squirrels, even the faint trickle of water somewhere downhill. When I started walking again, it was like the forest responded, going quieter, watching. I had marked a point on the map where the trail forked. One side looped back toward the road, a safe option. The other side wound deeper into the woods, along the ridgeline, with fewer clearings and no marked campsites. I wanted the harder path, the one people skipped. When I reached the fork, I turned left onto the ridge route and felt a little thrill in my chest. The ground angled upward, the air got thinner, and soon I was walking through taller pines that creaked when the wind pushed them. I passed broken branches, fallen trunks rotting into the soil, and I had to climb over a few sections where the trail had washed out. The silence grew heavier the higher I went. By midday, the trail became nothing more than a faint line of pressed down leaves. I kept following it, checking my phone every so often to make sure the blue dot stayed close to the line I had mapped. The signal was weak, but it worked just enough. My legs started to ache, and sweat ran down my back under my shirt. I pushed past the discomfort because I wanted the view I knew had to be waiting at the top of the ridge. Eventually, I reached it. The trees opened into a rocky outcrop, and I stood there catching my breath. Below me stretched a valley of endless green, the canopy broken by the shimmer of a river cutting through it. The air was still, no road noise, no human sound, only the faint buzzing of insects. I felt small, and for a moment I felt proud. I was far from everything, truly alone. I ate a handful of trail mix, drank again, and sat on a rock to rest. That was when I noticed something that unsettled me. On the far slope of the valley, across the river, there was movement. It wasn't an animal, not the way it moved. It was upright, dark against the lighter backdrop of trees, and it seemed to pause, then continue. I squinted, holding my hand over my eyes to block the sun. It looked like a person, but I was sure there weren't supposed to be any trails on that side. The maps showed nothing, no campsites, no paths. It was wilderness. Yet, there it was, something moving steadily through the trees. I told myself it could be a hunter or another hiker like me, though I knew the odds were slim. Still, I shook it off. It was too far to matter. I stood, adjusted my pack, and kept going. The trail on the ridge wound downward, switchbacks cut into the slope. The deeper I went, the darker it became. The trees grew closer, blocking out most of the light, and the air turned damp. My boots slipped on loose soil, and I had to grab trunks to steady myself. After another mile, the ground leveled out into a wide flat section where the canopy nearly touched overhead. It felt like walking into a cave. The air smelled of wet leaves and rot. That was when I noticed the prints. They weren't mine. The soil here was damp, soft, and there were depressions pressed deep into it. Footprints, human footprints, bare feet. They led forward along the same trail I was following. I froze, staring at them. The toes were clear, the arch, the heel. Whoever left them wasn't wearing shoes. My first thought was that maybe someone had gone swimming in the river and hiked back barefoot. But these prints weren't near the water, and they weren't fresh from just one direction. They crisscrossed, overlapped, going in and out of the trail. Some were pressed deep, like the person had stood in place. Others turned sharply, circling. I felt my chest tighten. I was miles from the road, deep in forest, and there were no cabins or houses anywhere close. Who would walk out here barefoot? I kept moving, but slower now, my senses sharper. Every snap of a branch made me stop and listen. The trail twisted again and narrowed until it was just a faint cut through the undergrowth. The footprints kept appearing, sometimes fading, sometimes sharp. Once I saw a spot where the soil was disturbed, like someone had knelt or sat. I didn't like it. I didn't like the thought of someone else out here, unseen, moving ahead of me or behind me. I checked my phone again. The signal was gone. The map froze, the blue dot stuck. My stomach felt heavy. I pushed on, wanting to get through the section and out into higher ground where maybe the reception would return. The forest grew denser, almost suffocating. I started hearing noises I couldn't place. Not animals, not birds. Something like a shuffle, slow, dragging. I told myself it was just the wind in the branches or maybe a deer moving through thick brush. But it didn't sound right. It was too steady, too close. I stopped again, holding my breath, and that was when I heard it. Clear, sharp, deliberate. A crack of wood under weight, behind me on the trail. I spun, staring down the way I had come. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and silence. My heart beat hard. I didn't move for a full minute, waiting, but the sound didn't come again. Finally, I forced myself to keep going, walking faster, my boots crunching leaves so I wouldn't have to hear anything else. After what felt like an hour, I came to a small clearing where the sunlight broke through. In the middle was a pile of rocks, stacked chest high, too neat to be natural. Someone had built it. The rocks were smooth, pulled from the river maybe, and balanced carefully. Around the base were bones. Small bones, animal I thought, rabbits, squirrels, but they were arranged in a ring. I felt sick looking at it. It wasn't some accident. Someone had made it. The bare footprints circled it, pressed deep into the soil. I stood there too long, frozen, and then I turned and walked the other way, off the trail, pushing through brush to put distance between me and that place. My arms scratched on branches, and my legs tangled in vines, but I didn't care. I just wanted away from it. The forest closed in tight, and I realized quickly that leaving the trail had been a mistake. The undergrowth slowed me to a crawl, and I lost all sense of direction. The trees looked the same, no markers, no signs, just endless green. I pulled my phone again. Still no signal. The battery was dropping. My breathing was fast, shallow, and I tried to calm myself. I told myself to keep moving uphill, find the ridge, and rejoin the trail. I kept walking, climbing over roots, stumbling on rocks, until sweat ran down my face and my arms bled from scratches. Then I saw it again. The footprints. Bare, human. Out here too, where I thought no one could be. My chest went cold. Whoever it was, they weren't just on the trail. They moved through the same wild ground I did. They knew this forest better than me. They weren't lost. I crouched, touching one of the prints. The soil was damp, and the edges still crumbled under my fingers. Fresh. I stood quickly and turned in circles, scanning the trees. Nothing, just shadows. But I felt watched, the way you feel eyes on you even when you can't see them. I started walking again, faster, almost running. Branches whipped against me, but I didn't stop. Every sound became dangerous, every tree a place for someone to hide. The light started to fade, and I realized I had been out far longer than I meant to. The forest dimmed, shadows stretched, and soon it would be dark. I couldn't afford to wander blind. I needed shelter, anywhere to wait until morning. I found a fallen tree with a hollow under its roots and crawled inside. It wasn't much, but it hid me. I sat there in the dirt, knees to my chest, clutching the knife from my pack. The forest changed at night. I had gone hiking many times before, but this one trip still stands out in my mind as the worst, the one that left me shaken long after I made it back home. Started like any other day. I had been restless for weeks, sitting at home and staring at screens, so I wanted to get out and move. I picked a trail I had read about online, not too far from where I lived, but still far enough into the backcountry that I expected quiet, maybe even complete solitude. That was what I was after. Silence, air, and miles of ground under my boots. The morning was gray but dry, cool enough that I wore a thin jacket, but not cold. The trailhead was empty when I parked my car. I liked that. No noise, no one else starting out. I slung my backpack over my shoulders, checked that I had my water bottles, snacks, and a small first aid kit, then tightened the straps. I glanced at the map nailed to the wooden board at the start of the trail. It showed a main path, a loop that ran about 10 miles with a few side trails branching off. 10 miles wasn't much, and I figured I could finish it before dark if I kept a steady pace. The dirt path started out wide and easy, cutting through low brush and scattered pines. The ground was damp from rain the night before, and I could smell wet soil and leaves. Birds darted between trees, and I could hear the soft hum of insects as the morning warmed up. My boots crunched softly as I walked, and soon I settled into a rhythm, breathing evenly and enjoying the calm. For the first couple of miles, everything felt normal. I stopped once to take off my jacket when the sun pushed through the clouds and warmed the air. I sipped some water and adjusted my pack. The trail climbed gently, winding higher into the woods, and the trees grew denser. The sounds of the road behind me vanished completely. By mile 3, the path narrowed, roots and rocks jutting up from the ground. I had to watch my step more carefully. I passed no one. I had expected at least 1 or 2 other hikers, maybe even someone with a dog, but the place was empty. I told myself that was a good thing. That was the whole point of hiking out here alone. But as the hours stretched, the emptiness began to feel heavy. Every sound seemed sharper. The snap of a twig under my boot echoed. When a squirrel darted through the brush, I jumped before realizing what it was. I noticed how the air seemed stiller under the thicker trees. Around mile 5, I stopped for a longer break. I found a log to sit on, pulled out a protein bar, and chewed slowly while looking around. My phone had no service, but I didn't care much about that. I wasn't planning to use it. I just wanted to rest my legs and breathe. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional creak of branches swaying far above me. When I stood and adjusted my pack again, I noticed something. A faint path, not marked on the map, split off from the main trail a few yards back. It was narrower, almost hidden by tall grass. I had walked right past it before, but now I saw it clearly. It looked like an animal trail more than a hiking route, but I felt a strange urge to see where it went. I told myself I would only follow it a short distance, just to satisfy my curiosity, then turn back to the main loop. I pushed through the brush and onto the faint track. The ground was uneven, but I could see footprints here and there, some human, some maybe deer. That reassured me. It meant people had walked here before. The trail wound deeper into the woods, twisting so that I soon lost sight of the main path. I told myself again I wouldn't go far, but each curve made me want to see what was next. The trees grew closer together, the light dimmer. The air smelled different here, heavier, like damp moss and rot. After maybe 20 minutes, I realized I had gone farther than I meant to. The faint track dipped down into a gully, then rose again on the other side. I hesitated. I hadn't marked the way I came in. I hadn't dropped anything behind me or noted landmarks. It was all just trees, endless and identical. I pulled out my phone, opened the compass app. The arrow spun for a few seconds, then steadied, but I couldn't tell if it was right. The canopy above was so thick that the light felt like late evening, even though it was only early afternoon. I told myself not to panic. All I had to do was backtrack. I turned around and started walking the way I thought I had come. The trail looked the same. I walked for 10 minutes, then stopped. Nothing looked familiar. I turned in a circle, scanning the trees, but everything blurred together. Brown trunks, green leaves, shadows. That was the first real moment when fear pricked at me. I swallowed it down and forced myself to think. I had been careless, but I could still fix this. I still had plenty of daylight. I would keep heading in one direction until I found the main loop again. It had to cross back eventually, so I walked. I walked for nearly an hour, my pace quickening without meaning to. My boots slid on damp leaves, and my shirt clung to my back with sweat. I drained half a bottle of water in a few gulps, then kept moving. The woods were silent except for my own sounds. Too silent. At some point, I tripped on a root and went down hard. My knee slammed into a rock, and pain shot through my leg. I cursed under my breath, sitting there for a long moment while I pressed my palm against the dirt. My knee throbbed, but I could still stand, still walk. I forced myself up and limped forward. The fear grew heavier the longer I went without finding the main trail. By the time the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched longer, I knew I was in real trouble. I hadn't found the loop. I hadn't even found a clearing or a stream, just more woods, endless woods. As evening came on, I realized I had a choice. Keep walking and risk wandering deeper, or stop and try to wait until morning. My throat was dry, and I had only one bottle of water left. My food was half gone. My knee ached with every step. The thought of spending the night in the woods made my chest tighten, but walking blind in the dark felt worse. I found a spot against a tree where the ground was flat and cleared a small patch of leaves. I sat down, hugged my pack against my chest, and tried to breathe slowly. The forest around me grew darker by the minute, shapes melting into shadow. That night was one of the longest of my life. Every noise made me flinch. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, the distant hoot of an owl. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me, and every sound felt too close. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, tense, eyes wide, waiting for the sky to lighten again. When dawn finally came, I stood on shaky legs and stretched my stiff body. My throat was dry, and my stomach growled. I forced down a granola bar and sipped the last of my water. My plan was simple. Pick one direction and stick to it until I hit something. A road, a creek, the main trail. Anything. The hours blurred as I walked. The sun climbed, heat pressed down. Sweat soaked my shirt. My mouth grew parched. My steps slowed, each one heavier. My knee pulsed with pain. By midday, I stumbled into a small clearing, and for a moment my chest lifted with hope. But the clearing was empty. Just tall grass, buzzing insects, and the same endless trees on all sides. I dropped my pack and sat hard on the ground. I tilted my bottle, hoping for one more swallow, but nothing came. Empty. That was when panic really sank in. My body needed water, and I had none. I tried to listen for the sound of running water, but all I heard was the blood pounding in my ears. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. I forced myself up again, legs shaking. The rest of that day was a blur of stumbling steps, crashing through brush, and fighting to keep moving. I scraped my arms on branches, twisted my ankle once, fell more times than I could count. My clothes were torn, my face streaked with sweat and dirt. When night came again, I barely had the strength to stay upright. I collapsed under another tree, body aching, lips cracked. I felt weak, hollow, dizzy. The darkness closed in, and for the first time, I thought I might not make it out. The next morning, I woke to birdsong. My body screamed in protest as I pushed myself up. My throat was so dry it hurt to swallow. My vision swam. I staggered forward, moving because I had to, not because I thought I would find anything. Then, faintly, I heard it, water. At first I thought I imagined it, but as I stood still and listened, I heard it clearly, the faint trickle of a stream. I pushed toward it, crashing through bushes, ignoring the pain in my legs. When I finally saw the thin line of water winding between rocks, I almost cried. I dropped to my knees and drank, hands shaking, ignoring how muddy it was. It was the best taste I had ever known. With water in me, my head cleared a little. I followed the stream, hoping it might lead to something bigger. Hours later, it did. The small stream merged into a wider creek, and along the bank I saw something that made my heart pound. A faded trail marker nailed to a tree. I staggered toward it, hardly believing it was real. The marker I decided to take a long hike one weekend because I wanted to clear my head. I had been working too much, spending too many hours indoors, and I thought being alone in the woods for a couple of days would be good for me. I picked a trail that wasn't very popular but was still marked on some maps. It stretched far into the hills, cutting through forest and climbing ridges before dropping into valleys where rivers ran cold and narrow. It was the kind of place where I knew I could walk for hours without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted. I started early in the morning, parking my car near the beginning of a gravel road that faded into dirt further up. The sun was still low, and the air was sharp and cold. I strapped on my backpack, tightened the laces of my boots, and followed the trail. It was quiet except for the sound of my steps and the occasional call of a bird waking up. I felt good, strong, and excited to cover distance. The first few hours went by smoothly. The path was clear enough, although leaves and fallen branches sometimes covered it. The forest felt old. Some of the trees were enormous, their trunks so wide I couldn't wrap my arms around them. The ground was soft with layers of needles and damp soil. The air smelled like moss and wet bark. Every now and then I saw tracks of animals. Deer mostly, sometimes raccoons, and once I spotted claw marks on a tree that made me stop and look around carefully. They looked fresh, but I told myself it was just a black bear passing through. By midday, I was deeper in than I had expected. The sun was higher, shining in patches through the thick canopy. I ate some food sitting on a log and listened to the forest. It was so still that I could hear my own chewing. I remember thinking it was strange that I hadn't seen a single other hiker, not even footprints on the path, but I liked it. The more isolated, the better. After lunch, the trail started climbing. It wound uphill, weaving between rocks and roots. I slowed down, my legs burning, but I kept at it because I wanted to reach the ridge before dark. The higher I climbed, the rougher the path became. In some places it narrowed so much I had to watch every step to avoid slipping. I used my hands to pull myself up ledges, feeling the grit of stone in my palms. By the time I reached the top, I was sweating hard, my shirt sticking to my back. The view was incredible. Hills rolled in every direction. Forests stretched like an endless carpet. And in the distance, I saw the glint of water that could have been a river or lake. I stayed there for a while, catching my breath, drinking water, and letting my legs rest. Then I started down the other side. The descent was steeper than I expected. Loose rocks slid under my boots, and I had to move slowly. I slipped once and landed on my hip, which left a dull ache. When I stood up, I noticed how silent everything was. No birds, no rustling, nothing. The forest seemed to be holding its breath. I told myself it was just because of the hour. Maybe animals were resting. The trail faded as I went lower. It wasn't gone, but it was harder to follow. Grass and weeds grew over it, and fallen branches blocked parts of it. I checked my map and compass, making sure I was still heading the right way. So I pushed on. It was late afternoon when I started feeling uneasy. I don't know why exactly. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed thicker, closing in, or maybe it was the sudden drop in temperature. My breath looked like smoke in the air, even though it hadn't been that cold earlier. I kept glancing behind me, certain I'd see something, but there was never anything there, just trees, rocks, and shadows. I kept hiking until the light began to dim. I knew I had to set up camp before it got dark. I found a small clearing beside a slope and unpacked my gear. I laid out my tent, gathered wood for a fire, and boiled some water for food. The work calmed me a little. Having a campfire flickering in front of me made me feel less alone. I ate slowly, sitting on a rock, staring into the flames while the forest around me darkened. But the feeling of unease didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up, but beyond its light was only blackness. The woods swallowed everything. I thought I heard faint movements, something stepping on dry leaves far out in the dark, but every time I froze and listened, it stopped. My nerves kept tightening. When I finally crawled into my tent, I zipped it up tight and lay still. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept drifting in and out, waking at the smallest sounds. Once, in the middle of the night, I heard something heavy moving just outside. The crunch of weight on branches, slow and deliberate. My body locked up, and I barely breathed. I waited, staring at the thin fabric wall of my tent, expecting a shadow to fall across it. But nothing happened. After a long time, the sounds faded. Morning came gray and damp. My nerves were raw, but I packed up and forced myself to keep going. I wanted to move forward, cover ground, and get this hike finished. The trail was barely visible now. It twisted through thick undergrowth, and several times I lost it entirely. I had to backtrack, scanning the ground for signs of old footprints or cuts in the earth. The forest changed as I went deeper. The trees grew taller but closer together, blocking out much of the sky. Moss clung to everything. The air smelled stagnant, almost sour, like rot. I found bones once, scattered in the dirt. Animal bones, I told myself, though they looked cracked and stripped clean. The silence pressed on me harder than before. I realized I hadn't heard a bird since the day before. No squirrels darting in the trees, no insects buzzing. Nothing moved except me. It was unnatural, and it made the hair on my arms stand up. Around midday, I stopped to drink water. That's when I noticed footprints in the mud ahead of me. They weren't mine. They looked old, half filled with rain and dirt, but they were human. Someone else had been through here. For a moment, I felt relief, but then I realized how strange it was. This trail was barely used. Why would someone else be this deep out here? And why hadn't I seen any sign of them earlier? I followed them for a while, though they came and went, sometimes disappearing on rocks or dry ground. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I became. The tracks didn't look like they were heading anywhere. They zigzagged, looped, doubled back. Whoever made them hadn't been hiking a straight path. The sky darkened early that day. Thick clouds rolled in, and the air grew heavy. Soon it started to rain, light at first, then harder. The trail turned slick, mud sucking at my boots. My jacket grew soaked, and water dripped down my neck. I pushed forward, but it became clear I'd have to camp again. I set up in the rain, fumbling with wet gear. My tent sagged, my firewood was damp, and I couldn't get a flame to catch. I ended up sitting in the dark, rain drumming on the tent, listening to the storm. It was worse than the night before. I kept imagining things moving out there, just beyond the edge of my hearing. At one point I swore I heard a splash, like something heavy stepping in a puddle nearby. When morning came, the rain stopped, but the ground was soggy. Mist hung low, curling between the trees. I packed up quickly and started walking. I just wanted out. I didn't care about finishing the trail anymore. I only cared about getting back to my car. But when I checked my map and compass, I realized I wasn't sure where I was. The trail was gone. I must have veered off during the storm. I tried to line up landmarks, but the forest looked the same in every direction. Panic started creeping in. I told myself to stay calm, to pick a direction and stick with it, but every step felt wrong. Hours passed. My legs ached, my stomach growled, and my water was running low. The mist never lifted. I walked through endless trees, over ridges, down gullies, across streams, but nothing looked familiar. Late that afternoon, I came across something that froze me in place. A campsite, old, abandoned, but still there. A collapsed tent, torn open, with a broken pole sticking out. Rusted can scattered around, half buried in dirt. A blackened fire ring filled with ash. I stood staring, rain dripping from the trees onto my hood. The camp looked like it had been left in a hurry. I didn't want to stay near it, but I couldn't help checking the ground. There were bones again, some small, some larger. I told myself they were from animals, but deep down I wasn't sure. I left quickly, pushing on through the forest with my heart hammering. Every sound made me jump now. A branch snapping in the distance, water dripping from leaves, the groan of wood shifting in the wind. I felt hunted, even though I never saw anything. That night, I didn't make camp. I kept walking until I couldn't anymore, then sat against a tree with my backpack still on. I drifted in and out of shallow sleep, jerking awake at the slightest noise. By the next morning, I knew I was lost for good. My map was useless now, my compass... I set out on the hike early in the morning, just after sunrise, when the air was still cold and the grass was wet with dew. My backpack felt heavier than it should have, but I had packed only what I thought I needed. Some food, water, a small first aid kit, a knife, a flashlight, and a light jacket. I carried a map and compass in the outer pocket, though I had looked over the trail before leaving and felt like I had it all in my head. The sky was clear, the air sharp, and the forest ahead looked calm, almost inviting. I felt good, strong, and confident that I could spend a whole day out there without trouble. The trail started off wide and easy, almost like a dirt road. It wound through tall pines that rose like columns, their trunks dark and rough, their tops swaying slightly even though there wasn't much wind. The ground was littered with needles and broken twigs. Every so often I'd see small animal tracks pressed into the soil, little signs of life that reminded me how alive the woods really were, even if I couldn't see anything moving. My boots crunched softly against the earth, the sound steady and rhythmic, almost comforting. For the first hour, it felt like nothing more than a long walk. The trail climbed gently, weaving up into higher ground. I stopped once to drink some water and adjust the straps on my backpack. Everything seemed fine. I didn't think much about where I was, because I trusted the path. But paths in the woods have a way of changing when you stop paying attention. As I kept going, I started noticing that the trail looked less used. The dirt grew thinner, grass and weeds crept across it, and roots bulged through the soil like veins. The trees seemed closer together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out more of the sun. It got darker even though it was still mid-morning. I checked my map, but I didn't see this section marked clearly. The line on the paper showed one continuous trail, but in front of me it looked like the path was fading. I kept going, telling myself it would clear up again soon. The silence grew heavier. Earlier I had heard birds, the occasional crackle of a squirrel darting through brush, but now it felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. My footsteps sounded louder than before. Each time I stopped, I could hear the faint rustle of leaves somewhere behind me, or maybe off to the side. At first I thought it was just the normal sounds of a forest, but after a while it felt too steady, too deliberate, like something was moving when I moved. I turned around more than once, scanning the trees, looking for any sign of movement. There was nothing but rough bark, dark shadows, and the endless clutter of branches and leaves. The kind of place where anything could be hiding only a few feet away, and you'd never see it. I tried to push the thought away and kept walking. The ground started sloping downhill, steeper than before. I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a long time. The official path had small wooden signs nailed to trees, little blazes of paint here and there, but now there was nothing. I told myself maybe I had just missed the last one, but after 20 minutes with no sign at all, I knew I was off trail. I stopped again, pulled out the map, and studied it. The problem was, the paper showed general lines, not exact trees or bends, and when you're surrounded by forest, everything looks the same. The compass needle pointed north, steady and sure, but I couldn't match the ground around me to anything on the map. I decided to keep moving downhill, figuring it would eventually lead me to water, and if I found a stream or river, I could follow it back to a more recognizable area. It seemed logical at the time. As I moved downhill, the terrain grew rougher. Rocks jutted from the ground, some loose under my boots, and the soil was damp, slick in places where moss grew thick. I slipped once, catching myself against a tree, and felt the sting of bark scrape my palm. The woods smelled stronger down there, earthy, damp, with a faint rot that reminded me of wet leaves and old wood. I thought about how easy it would be to twist an ankle out there, how far I already was from the starting point, and how nobody really knew the exact area I had planned to hike. Hours passed, and the sun shifted, though I could barely see it through the thick canopy. I checked my watch, surprised to see it was already early afternoon. Hunger gnawed at me, so I stopped to eat a little. As I chewed, I heard something again. A branch snapping, leaves shifting. Not far off. I froze, listening. It wasn't wind. It wasn't some distant bird. It was heavier, closer, like a footstep. I sat perfectly still, my back against a tree, holding my breath. The sound came again, then stopped. I waited, every muscle tense, staring into the thicket of trees. Nothing moved. Nothing showed itself. Finally, after what felt like forever, I forced myself to stand and keep going. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or something else that didn't care about me. But the way it had stopped when I stopped didn't sit right in my head. The downhill slope leveled out into a hollow, darker and colder than the ridges above. The ground was soft with layers of dead leaves. My boots sank slightly into the damp soil with each step. In the middle of the hollow was what I had been looking for, a narrow stream winding its way through the woods. Relief hit me when I saw it. I crouched, filled my water bottle, and splashed cold water on my face. The sound of the stream was the first steady noise I had heard in hours, and it calmed me a little. I decided to follow the water downstream. Rivers lead somewhere, and I hoped this one would eventually bring me back toward a road or even another trail. For a while it was easy, just walking alongside the water. But soon the banks grew steep and muddy, forcing me to climb over fallen logs and weave through thick brush. I stumbled more than once, sweat soaking into my shirt, the straps of my backpack digging into my shoulders. As I pushed through the brush, I caught another sound. This time it was closer, sharper, the definite crack of a stick breaking under weight. My chest tightened. I stopped and crouched low, peering back through the trees. Again, nothing moved, but the feeling that something was following me grew stronger. My heart hammered as I pictured the possibilities. A bear, maybe, though it didn't sound like one. A bear would have made more noise. This was careful, too careful. The sun dropped lower, shadows stretching long across the forest floor. The air cooled quickly. I realized I needed to think about where I would spend the night. The thought unsettled me. I hadn't planned on staying out there after dark. I had no tent, only the jacket and what I carried. Still, the forest didn't care about my plans. Night was coming whether I liked it or not. I found a small rise beside the stream, a patch of ground clear enough to sit on, and dropped my pack there. I forced myself to eat a little more, though my stomach was tight with nerves. As I sat, I kept glancing toward the trees, certain I would see movement. My ears strained for every sound. The woods were alive with tiny noises, branches creaking, water trickling, insects buzzing. But under it all, I felt something else, like a rhythm out of sync with the rest. Dusk fell, and with it came a kind of darkness I wasn't ready for. In the woods, night doesn't come slowly. It drops like a curtain. One moment you can still see the outlines of trees. The next, they're just black shapes pressed against an even blacker sky. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow path through the dark. The circle of light made me feel safer, but also trapped. Anything outside of it could be watching, and I'd never know. I sat awake for hours, my back against the pack, the knife clutched in my hand. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent adrenaline flooding through me. Once, I thought I saw eyes reflecting in the beam of my light, low to the ground, far off between two trees. I froze, aiming the light, but the eyes blinked out, gone before I could be sure they were ever there. My throat was dry even though I had water. I was too afraid to drink. The night dragged on, slow and brutal. I must have dozed for short moments, but each time I startled awake, heart pounding, sure that something had moved closer. At one point I thought I heard breathing, soft, steady, not mine, coming from the trees behind me. I spun the light, saw nothing, but the sound stayed with me long after. Finally, after what felt like forever, a faint gray light crept into the woods. Morning. I was stiff, cold, and exhausted, but alive. The sounds of the forest returned. The distant calls of birds, the chatter of squirrels, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined everything. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks in the dark. I packed up quickly, eager to keep moving. I followed the stream again, forcing myself forward even though every muscle ached. Hours passed. I lost track of time. The woods felt endless. But eventually, the trees began to thin, and I caught a glimpse of something through the branches. An opening. I pushed harder, my boots slipping in mud, my pack bouncing against my back. When I broke through the tree line, I almost cried. A dirt road stretched in front of me. I parked my car on the side of a narrow dirt road, just past a faded wooden sign that marked the start of the trail. The morning was gray, a dull blanket of clouds hanging low over the hills. I had come out here for a long solo hike. I told myself it was for exercise, for the quiet, for the kind of thinking I could only do when I was alone. But there was more to it. I wanted to test myself. I wanted to see how far I could go into the deep part of the trail where hardly anyone went. The ground was damp from rain the night before. My boots sank lightly into the mud, making soft, sucking noises as I walked. The air smelled of wet leaves and moss. The first part of the trail wound through open woodland, young trees spaced apart with grass and ferns in between. I adjusted the straps of my backpack, heavy with water bottles, food, a flashlight, a map, and a small first aid kit. I thought I was prepared. As the trail climbed, the trees grew closer together. The sky dimmed under the canopy, and I could hear the sound of water trickling somewhere downhill. The silence pressed in. No cars, no people, just the faint squeak of my pack straps and the steady crunch of my steps. Every now and then a bird called high and sharp, then stopped suddenly as if cut off. Hours passed. I checked my watch often, though I wasn't really keeping track of the time. The trail grew rougher the farther I went. Roots twisted across the path like ropes. Fallen branches forced me to duck and weave. At times I had to climb over slick rocks, gripping trees to keep from sliding. I stopped for a drink and pulled out my map. The paper was already soft with moisture. According to it, I was halfway to a ridge where the trail would narrow and follow a high stretch overlooking a steep drop. That was where I wanted to reach before turning back. I stuffed the map away and kept walking. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. The woods were different here. The trees were older, their trunks thick, bark rough like scales. Moss hung from the branches in damp strands. The ground was uneven, covered in layers of wet leaves that made every step a little uncertain. It felt like no one had been here in a long time. I told myself not to think about that, but every time I stopped, I could hear small noises, the faint crack of a twig, the rustle of something moving in the undergrowth. I scanned the woods, but saw nothing, just trees stretching in every direction, their shapes blending together. I pushed on, my breath steaming in the cool air. My shirt clung to my back with sweat. The trail turned steep, winding up toward the ridge. My legs burned with the climb. I kept my head down, watching where I placed each foot, until at last I reached the top. The ridge was narrower than I expected. On one side, the ground dropped sharply into a tangle of trees and rocks far below. On the other side, the slope fell into a dark hollow. The trail itself was no more than a strip of dirt pressed into the earth. I moved carefully, my pack shifting with each step. From up there, the view stretched far across the valley. A patchwork of forest spread to the horizon, broken only by a thin line that might have been a river. It should have been beautiful, but something about it made me feel small and cut off. I was alone, too deep in the woods, with nothing but miles of empty land in every direction. I sat on a flat rock to rest, pulling out some food. As I chewed, I kept glancing around, my nerves unsettled. Then I saw it, a shape down the ridge trail, not an animal, person. He was standing far away, maybe 100 yards down the path. I froze with food halfway to my mouth. He wasn't walking, just standing still, facing my direction. Too far to see his face, but I could make out his clothes. Dark, plain, and wrong somehow, as if they were worn and stained. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't call out, just stood there. I felt a sharp sting of fear. My first thought was to pack up and head back, but I told myself it was just another hiker. Maybe he stopped to rest too. I forced myself to look away and focus on eating. When I looked back, he was gone. I scanned the ridge, the slope, the hollow below. No one, just trees and shadows. My stomach tightened. I stuffed the rest of my food away and stood up. I told myself to keep moving, that I was being jumpy. The trail sloped down the far side of the ridge, twisting through thick woods. I walked fast, almost too fast, breathing hard. Every few steps I glanced behind me. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, nothing else. Then I heard it, a footstep, not mine. A single, solid crunch on the leaves, behind me, just out of sync with my own. I spun around. Nothing. Empty trail, silent woods. I stood there for a long time, heart hammering, ears straining. The silence pressed harder, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then I turned and walked, faster this time, trying to keep calm. The trail narrowed, roots snaking across it. My boots slipped on the damp ground. My mind kept circling back to the same thought. Someone was following me. Couldn't prove it. I couldn't see anyone. But every time I slowed down, I thought I could hear something faint behind me. A shuffle, a faint scrape, then silence. I wanted to stop and wait, to see if someone came, but the idea filled me with dread. So I kept going, deeper into the woods, though I no longer wanted to be there. By late afternoon, the light had dimmed even more under the heavy clouds. The woods were growing darker, and I knew I had to turn back soon if I wanted to reach my car before nightfall. I pulled out my map, hands shaking slightly. The trail I was on looped back toward the start if I followed it, though it was the long way. I decided to take it rather than retrace my steps up the ridge where I had seen that figure. I started down the loop. The ground was rough, muddy in places with steep inclines. My legs ached with every step. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in. Branches reached low, brushing my shoulders, clawing at my pack. The air smelled of wet rot. I kept glancing behind me. Nothing, just the endless trees. Yet the feeling of being watched never left. Then, near a bend in the trail, I saw it again. Person partly hidden by trees. Closer this time, standing still, facing me. I stopped dead. My breath came fast and shallow. I stared, trying to make out details. It looked like the same figure from before, same dark clothes, same stillness. But the face was shadowed. I blinked, and he was gone. I didn't wait. I turned and walked as fast as I could, almost jogging, my pack bouncing. My boots slipped on the wet ground, and I nearly fell more than once. My mind screamed at me to stay calm, but my body wanted only to get out. The forest grew darker as evening came. The trail wound endlessly, never looking familiar, each bend revealing only more trees. My watch said I had been hiking for nearly 9 hours. I should have been close to the road by now, but nothing looked right. I stopped to catch my breath, bending over, hands on my knees. That was when I heard it, louder this time. Footsteps, not one but several, close, moving through the leaves. I snapped upright, spinning around. The trail was empty, but the sound was still there, just beyond the trees. Moving. Panicked, I ran. My pack thumped against my back, straps digging into my shoulders. My lungs burned. Branches whipped across my arms and face as I crashed down the trail. I didn't care if I fell. I just had to get out. The footsteps followed. Behind me, steady, relentless. The trail twisted, and I lost my footing, sliding down a muddy slope. I landed hard, pain shooting through my hip. I scrambled up, gasping, covered in wet dirt. My flashlight had fallen from my pack. I grabbed it and shoved it into my pocket without turning it on. I forced myself to keep moving. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, but I knew whoever, or whatever, was out there hadn't just vanished. The woods grew black as night fell. I pulled out the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut a narrow path through the dark, catching on wet leaves and the pale bark of trees. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every sound made me whip the light around. I walked fast, almost stumbling, flashlight trembling in my hand. Hours seemed to pass. My throat was dry, my legs numb with exhaustion. I kept expecting the trail to open onto the road, but it never did. At last I saw something, a glint of metal through the trees. I staggered toward it, heart leaping. It was a rusted fence, half buried in the undergrowth. Beyond it, a faint line of dirt road. Relief flooded me. I pushed through the brush, scraped my hands on the wire, and stumbled onto the road. I turned, shining the flashlight back into the woods. For a moment, I saw him again, the figure, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. Then I blinked, and the trees were empty. I didn't wait to see if he was still there. I ran down the dirt road until I reached my car. I fumbled the keys. I never really thought much about what could go wrong on a solo hike. I always read about people who got lost, people who slipped down cliffs, people who went missing for days, but those were always other people. I always assumed I was careful enough, strong enough, smart enough to avoid being in those situations. I carried maps, I packed food. I had a small first aid kit, a headlamp, a lighter, and a knife. I wasn't careless. I told myself that was enough. That morning started like any other hike I'd done. The air was cool when I parked the car and shouldered my pack, the sun barely starting to light up the treetops. I picked a trail I had read about online, one that wasn't crowded but still marked, a place where you could walk for hours without running into more than one or two people. That was what I wanted, quiet. The first stretch of trail was gentle. Pine needles muffled my footsteps, and the smell of resin hung heavy in the air. Birds flicked through branches above me, the forest still waking up. I felt calm, almost too calm. There's a sort of comfort in moving your legs in rhythm, carrying your pack, hearing the crunch of gravel or dirt under your shoes. The simple, you just keep going. After the first mile, the path narrowed. It turned rocky, winding higher into the hills. I liked that. I liked feeling my thighs burn and my lungs work harder. I liked the sweat beginning to build on my back under the straps. I stopped once to drink from my water bottle, checked the trail sign where two paths split, and kept going on the one that climbed deeper into the ridge. Hours passed quietly. The forest changed as I moved higher. The tall pines thinned out, replaced by scrub and twisted trees that clung to rocks. I could see farther in every direction. Rolling hills, valleys filled with mist, jagged outcrops in the distance. It was beautiful, almost unreal. I stopped to eat a granola bar and just stood there, staring out across the emptiness. I felt small but also free. The trail got harder after that. Narrow, loose stones, drop-offs on one side where the land just fell away. I picked my steps carefully. I never looked down for too long. I focused on where to put my feet, how to shift my weight. I told myself I'd turn back after a while, once I reached the next ridge. That's when I noticed I hadn't seen a single person all morning. Not one. Usually you pass somebody, another hiker, maybe a pair coming down while you're going up. But there had been no one. Just me, the trail, and the sound of wind pushing through dry brush. It wasn't alarming yet, just strange. I shrugged it off, figuring I picked an unpopular day. By early afternoon, the heat grew sharp. The sun baked the rocks, and the air felt thinner. I was sweating harder, drinking more often. My water bottle was already half empty, and I knew I should save what was left for the hike back. I pulled my hat lower against the glare and kept moving. I reached a high point, a ridge where the trail seemed to fade into rocks and scrub. There was no sign, no arrow, just faint markings of dirt worn by boots. I followed what looked like a path, though it wasn't as clear anymore. I told myself it was fine. I'd just go a little farther and then turn around. But the path kept pulling me forward. Every time I thought about stopping, I saw just one more rise ahead, one more place where the view might be better. I told myself I'd stop at the next one, and then the next, and soon I realized I wasn't sure exactly which way I'd come from anymore. The trail wasn't marked here. The ground was just loose rock and dry plants, nothing to guide me. That was the first time I felt uneasy. I stopped, set my pack down, and turned in a slow circle. The ridge stretched in both directions, broken by gullies and outcrops. Behind me, the trail I thought I came from looked less certain. There were faint lines of dirt winding down, but they all looked the same. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something I didn't want to call fear. I told myself not to panic. I had been paying attention. I just needed to retrace my steps. I chose the direction I thought was right and started down, moving slowly, scanning the ground for signs of footprints or packed dirt. The farther I went, the less sure I became. The slope dropped sharply, and the ground was loose. I slipped once, catching myself on my hands, scraping my palm. Dust stuck to my sweat. I wiped my hand on my shorts and kept moving, but the uneasy feeling grew. At the bottom of the slope, the trail vanished completely. Just brush, rocks, and dry gullies twisting in every direction. My chest tightened. I pulled out my phone, knowing before I even checked what it would show. No signal. The screen was blank except for the time. I swallowed hard and put it back in my pocket. I wasn't lost, I told myself. Not yet. I just needed to climb back up, get higher, find the trail again. That was the smart move. I started climbing. The rocks were sharp, shifting under my shoes. My legs ached, my lungs burned, and sweat stung my eyes. I kept going, forcing myself up, hands gripping stone, pack dragging me backward. By the time I reached the ridge again, my shirt was soaked and my throat was dry. I looked around. Nothing looked familiar. Every slope, every cluster of brush, every jagged outcrop. It all looked the same. The trail was gone. That's when the real fear hit. Not the passing unease, not the small doubts. Real fear, the kind that makes your stomach clench and your hands shake. I stood there, staring out at the empty land, and realized I didn't know where I was. I didn't know which way to go. The sun was higher now, glaring down. My water was almost gone. My legs trembled from the climb, and the cut on my palm throbbed. I forced myself to take a deep breath. I couldn't lose control. That would kill me faster than anything. I needed a plan. I remembered reading once that the best thing to do when you're lost is to stay put. But standing there on the ridge with the heat beating down, staying put felt like waiting to die. I couldn't bring myself to just sit and wait, so I picked a direction. I chose the one that looked like it sloped down into a valley, thinking maybe there would be water, maybe a creek or a stream. I told myself valleys usually lead somewhere. The descent was brutal. Loose stones rolled under my feet. I slipped again and slammed my knee into rock. Pain shot up my leg, sharp and deep. I hissed through my teeth, gripping my thigh until it eased. The knee throbbed with every step after that, but I kept moving. The valley was nothing like I hoped. No water, no trail, just a dry gully choked with brush. The air felt hotter down there, the sun reflecting off the stone walls. My mouth was sticky, my tongue felt heavy. I took a tiny sip from my bottle, the last of it, and stared at the empty plastic when it was gone. Panic pressed harder against my chest. I shoved the bottle back in my pack even though it was useless. My legs shook from fatigue. My head felt light. I sat down in the dirt, sweat dripping from my face, and tried to think. All around me, the land stretched out in ridges and gullies, endless and harsh. No sound but the hiss of wind. No sign of people, no sign of water. Just heat, stone, and silence. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe minutes, maybe longer. My thoughts turned heavy, slow. I imagined search parties, people walking past this very place without ever knowing I was here. I imagined my car sitting alone in the parking lot, dust settling on it. But something inside me refused to stop. I forced myself up, legs trembling, and started moving again. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just walked, dragging my body forward, one foot after the other. Hours passed like that. My throat burned. My lips cracked. Every step was harder than the last. I stumbled often, sometimes falling to my knees, sometimes catching myself on rocks. My head buzzed with heat. By late afternoon, shadows stretched across the land. The sun dipped lower, red and merciless. I reached another ridge and looked out, my vision blurry. For the first time all day, I saw something different. A line of green cutting through the valley below. Trees. Trees meant water. They had to. I stumbled down the slope, nearly falling with every step. My knee screamed, my scraped hand stung, but I didn't stop. At the bottom, I pushed through brush and thorns until I heard it. Faint, but real. Running water. I almost cried. I followed the sound and found a narrow stream trickling through the rocks. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I dropped to my knees and drank straight from it, the cold water shocking my mouth, sliding down my dry throat. I drank until my stomach ached, then splashed my face, letting the coolness sink into my skin. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last. The sun was almost gone. The valley was darkening fast, and I had no idea where I was. No trail, no bearings, no plan. Just me, a stream, and the vast, empty land around me. I knew I couldn't move in the dark. The rocks I had been wanting to get away from everything for a while, so when the weekend opened up, I picked a random spot on the map, just a section of forest I had never been to before. There wasn't much information about it online, just that there were some old logging roads and a few marked trails that eventually faded into rougher terrain. That was good enough for me. I wasn't looking for popular hikes with crowded paths or tourist spots. I wanted quiet, real woods, the kind where you could walk for hours without seeing another person. I started early in the morning, driving down the narrow road that wound deeper into the forest. The air was cool when I parked the car at a small pull-off, just enough space for 2 vehicles, though I was the only one there. The forest looked dense and endless from that spot. The smell of damp soil and pine needles carried on the air. I slung on my pack, tightened the straps, and set out. The trail was faint but visible, pressed down over years by boots and maybe old tires. The ground was uneven, scattered with rocks and roots, but it felt good to move under the canopy of trees. Everything around me was alive with small sounds. Birds hopping from branch to branch, squirrels darting across the path, insects buzzing in the sunlit breaks. The first stretch felt calm, easy, almost too easy. The deeper I went, the more overgrown the trail became. Branches reached across the path, brushing against my arms, and tall grass pushed up between the ruts. It was clear this place didn't see much traffic anymore. I liked that. It felt like stepping back into something untouched. But after an hour, the trail narrowed so much it was hardly recognizable. I followed it anyway, careful not to lose sight of its faint groove in the dirt. The air grew heavier as the trees thickened. I realized I had stopped hearing birds. It was subtle at first, just the absence of chirping, but soon the silence became total. My boots crunched on gravel and sticks, but beyond that, nothing. Even the wind seemed caught somewhere higher in the treetops, leaving the forest floor still and quiet. I pushed forward, but my pace slowed. The trail disappeared altogether after a while, and I was left guessing where it had gone. I checked the direction of the sun, noting how it was angling west, and kept moving deeper. My map wasn't much help. It was one of those generic forest maps that only showed the largest trails and landmarks. I wasn't worried though. I had water, food, and plenty of daylight left. It wasn't until I stumbled across the first sign of something unnatural that I felt the hairs on the back of my neck lift. It was a piece of rope tied between 2 trees, low to the ground, almost hidden by leaves. It looked old, frayed, covered in moss, like it had been there for years. I stepped over it carefully, but the sight stayed in my head. Why would someone put it there? It wasn't marking a path. It felt more like it was marking a boundary. I kept moving, telling myself it was nothing, maybe left behind by hunters or loggers. But soon I began to notice more. A rusted tin can half buried in the dirt, a piece of cloth snagged on a branch, and then an old shoe, torn and weathered, lying on its side in the mud. None of it looked fresh, but it unsettled me. These weren't things you usually found this deep, not in a place where almost no one came anymore. The sun had slipped lower by then, its light cutting sharp beams through the trees. I told myself I would hike another 30 minutes, then turn back. I didn't want to push it too far and risk losing my way after dark. My breathing was steady, but I felt a tension building in my chest, a kind of alertness that made me scan every shadow. That's when I heard the first sound. It was faint, far off, like a branch snapping under weight. I froze, straining to listen. The forest was too quiet for it to be an animal just moving naturally. It was heavy, deliberate. I stayed still for a long moment, then forced myself to keep walking, slower this time, each step careful. Not long after, I heard it again. Closer, a crunch of leaves, a break of twigs. I stopped and looked around, but there was nothing between the trees, only the dim light and thick undergrowth. My throat felt dry, and I reached for my water bottle, more to steady my nerves than because I needed it. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even a bear, but the sound didn't match. It came in short bursts, like something moving and then stopping when I stopped. That was what unnerved me most. It wasn't constant. It was measured. I tried to shake it off and decided it was time to head back. I turned, looking for the faint trail I had followed in, but it wasn't there. The ground all looked the same. Patches of mud, tangled roots, scattered leaves. My stomach sank as I realized I had been so focused on what I was hearing that I hadn't been paying enough attention to where I was going. I took a slow breath and picked a direction, one I thought was right, and started moving. My boots sank slightly into damp soil as I walked, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something. The forest pressed in on me, darker now, the silence almost suffocating. After maybe 20 minutes, I came across something that made me stop dead. It was another rope, stretched between trees, the same kind as before, but this one had a rusted tin can dangling from it, like a crude alarm. My chest tightened. This wasn't random. Someone had put it there on purpose. I backed up a step, heart hammering. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to answer. Who was putting these ropes here? Why? And why so deep in the woods? That's when I heard it again. The sound of movement, not far now. My breath caught as I realized it was behind me. I didn't turn to look. Instead, I walked faster, almost tripping over the uneven ground, pushing through branches that clawed at my arms. My only thought was to put distance between me and that sound. But the more I walked, the more I found. Another rope, another can, another strange marker that didn't belong. At one point, I found a small clearing where the ground was flattened. The grass pushed down in circles, like someone had been sitting there for hours. There were bones nearby, small ones, probably animal, but picked clean and scattered. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me, and every sound I made seemed too loud. I tried to move quietly, but my boots kept snapping twigs, giving me away. Behind me, the noise of movement followed, steady, patient. My chest burned from breathing too hard, but I didn't stop. I kept moving until I finally saw something that made my stomach drop completely. A tree with deep cuts in its bark, long vertical marks like someone had taken a knife and dragged it down again and again. At the base of the tree was another shoe. This one looked newer. I didn't touch it. I didn't even pause for long. I just kept going, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get out. The light was almost gone when I finally stumbled onto a faint road, little more than 2 ruts pressed into the dirt, but it was enough. I followed it as fast as I could, lungs aching, until I recognized where I was. The pull-off where my car sat waiting, silent and alone. Relief hit me so hard my knees nearly buckled. I didn't waste time. I threw my pack in the car, started the engine, and drove. My hands shook on the wheel as the forest slipped away in the rearview mirror, the trees closing in behind me like they had never let me go. I didn't see anyone on the drive out. No houses, no cars, nothing. Just empty roads stretching on. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until the forest was only a dark line on the horizon. Even then, the silence stayed with me. That heavy, unnatural quiet, and the sound of something moving just behind me, always stopping when I did. I never went back, and I never will. I had been planning the hike for weeks. I wanted something long, something that would test me, something far from the noise of towns and highways. I didn't tell many people about it because I liked doing things alone. It gave me a sense of freedom, I could move at my own pace, take breaks whenever I wanted, and change my route without having to explain myself. I chose a stretch of trail that cut through deep forest, old growth, with miles between trailheads and not many side exits. Most people I knew wouldn't even consider going out there alone. That was part of why I wanted to do it. The morning I set out, the air was cool but heavy with the smell of wet earth. It had rained the night before. The ground still held water, and every step made a soft crunch mixed with dampness. My boots sank slightly into the soil, and my pack pressed down on my shoulders. I carried enough food for a few days, a tent, a small stove, water, a filter, and basic gear. Everything was strapped tight, but still I could feel the weight. The trail started wide, a mix of gravel and dirt, but soon it narrowed into a path no wider than my boots. Trees leaned in close, tall and thick, their branches woven together above, shutting out most of the sky. I could hear water dripping from the leaves, falling in steady rhythm. Insects buzzed in the air, and every now and then, a bird screeched from somewhere far above. The first few hours went smooth. My legs warmed up, and my breathing found a rhythm. I liked the quiet. My mind wandered as I walked. I thought about work, about the little problems waiting for me back in town, about how different it felt to be away from all of that. Out here, the only thing that mattered was putting one foot in front of the other. After a while, I noticed the trail wasn't marked as clearly as I expected. There were blazes on some trees, but they were faded, chipped paint, and sometimes whole stretches went without a sign. I had a map in my pack, a paper one, and I pulled it out a few times to check. The lines looked simple on paper, but on the ground, every bend and every fork seemed less clear. I kept going, trusting the main path. By mid-afternoon, the forest seemed thicker. The air felt still. I realized I hadn't heard birds for a while. The silence wasn't total. There was still the sound of branches moving slightly, drops of water hitting the ground, and my boots on dirt, but it felt heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. I kept pushing, trying to make good time. I wanted to set up camp before dark. I checked my watch and I thought I had a couple more hours of light left. But the trees above blocked so much of the sky that it was already dim under the canopy. That's when I saw the first sign that something wasn't right. The trail split. It wasn't on the map. One path veered left, slightly uphill, and the other dipped right, downhill into thicker trees. Neither had a blaze. I stopped, adjusted the pack on my shoulders, and stared at both directions. The uphill path looked more worn, but not by much. The downhill one looked almost swallowed by undergrowth. I picked the left path, uphill, thinking it was more likely to be the right way. The incline made my legs burn, but I pushed through. After about 15 minutes, I realized the ground was getting rockier, the trees thinner, and the trail was fading. Soon, I was stepping over stones and ducking branches, and the path was almost gone. I stopped again, breathing hard, and checked the map. Nothing matched. Frustration crept in. I decided to turn back and take the other fork. But when I went back down, I couldn't find it. The trail I thought I had just walked on seemed to vanish into the trees. I turned circles, scanning the ground, looking for my own boot prints in the damp soil. For a few minutes, I thought I found them, but they just led me deeper into undergrowth. The panic came slow, not all at once. First, it was a tightness in my chest. Then my breathing sped up. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I just needed to backtrack carefully. But the more I moved, the less things looked familiar. Every tree looked like the last. The forest closed in from all sides. I stopped moving and forced myself to breathe. I pulled out my compass. The map said the trail generally ran east-west, so I picked a direction I thought was west and started walking slow, careful, counting steps. My boots scraped roots, and branches clawed at my arms. I told myself I would eventually cut back onto the trail, but I didn't. The ground dipped, then rose, then dipped again, uneven. The light grew weaker, shadows longer. My shirt clung to me with sweat, even though the air was cooling. At one point, I thought I heard water. I turned toward it, thinking maybe it was a stream marked on the map, something I could use to orient myself. But when I got closer, the sound faded, until there was nothing but silence again. By then, The dim light told me evening was coming fast. I had to stop and make camp before I couldn't see it all. I found a small flat patch of ground between two big trees and dropped my pack. My hands shook as I unrolled the tent, fumbling with the poles. I had done it a dozen times before, but now every movement felt clumsy. I got it up finally, crawled inside, and zipped it shut. The silence pressed in harder at night. I boiled water and ate quickly, barely tasting the food. My ears kept straining for sounds outside. Once, I thought I heard something moving slowly through the underbrush. Not close, but steady. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth, listening. After a few seconds, it stopped. I sat there in the dim light of my headlamp, waiting, but nothing else came. When I finally lay down, sleep didn't come easy. Every crack of a branch, every rustle made me open my eyes. At one point, I thought I saw a faint light flickering between the trees, like fire or a flashlight. I sat up fast, staring through the mesh of the tent. The light was gone almost as soon as I noticed it. I couldn't be sure I had even seen it. The night stretched long, and I barely slept. When morning came, the sky was gray and heavy, and mist hung low over the ground. I packed up quick, wanting to move before the damp seeped into my bones. I picked a direction again, steady west, and started walking. The forest all looked the same. I kept checking the compass, kept checking the map, but the lines on paper didn't connect to the world around me. Hours passed, my legs aching, my throat dry even though I rationed water. The forest wasn't empty, but it felt wrong. A few times I saw old signs of people. An old rusted can, half buried in dirt, a length of rope tied around a tree and grown into the bark, but they looked ancient, abandoned. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. I had been stumbling, catching my boots on roots, barely lifting my feet. Then I saw something through the trees, a shape, straight lines where nature usually curves. I pushed toward it, my heart racing. It was a structure, a small cabin, old, rotting, half hidden in the brush. The wood was dark, warped by years of weather. The roof sagged. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Relief mixed with unease. I didn't know who it belonged to, or if anyone used it, but it was shelter. I circled slowly, scanning the ground. There were no fresh tracks, no signs of recent use. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust. The floor creaked under my weight. Inside was one room, empty except for an old metal frame of a bed, its mattress long gone, and a broken chair in the corner. Cobwebs stretched across the beams. I dropped my pack and sat. For the first time since getting lost, I felt a little safer, though not much. I set up my stove on the floor and boiled water. As I ate, I thought I heard something again. Faint, like footsteps outside. I froze, staring at the door. The sound passed. I told myself it was an animal. That night, I slept in the cabin. I locked the door with a stick wedged under the handle. Still, I woke often, listening. Once, I thought I heard breathing just outside, slow and steady. My own chest tightened as I held my breath, waiting. It went on for what felt like minutes, then faded. The next morning, I left the cabin and kept moving. My food was running low. My legs felt heavy. The forest stretched endless. No trail, no markers, just trees. 2 more days passed like that. I rationed every bite, every sip. I barely slept, always listening for movement in the dark. Once, while crouched by a stream filling my bottle, I saw footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. The tread was different, fresher. My stomach dropped, and I looked around fast, but the trees were empty. I never saw anyone, but I felt watched. On the 4th day, when I was at the edge of collapse, I broke through the tree line. The woods fell away, and there was a dirt road, rough but real. I stumbled onto it, nearly crying with relief. I followed it, dragging my feet, until finally I saw a truck parked on the side. It was empty, but it meant people were nearby. Hours later, I never really planned that hike. It was more of a spur-of-the-moment decision, the kind you make when the restlessness inside you grows too heavy to ignore. I had been sitting in my small apartment for weeks, feeling like the walls were pressing in on me. I needed air, space, and silence away from the endless hum of the city. So, on a Saturday morning in late September, I packed a backpack, threw in some food, water, a flashlight, and a knife I kept around for camping. I checked the weather, clear skies, cool nights, and decided I would go out to the hills just outside the national forest, hike deep enough that I wouldn't hear traffic, maybe even camp for the night if I felt like it. It was random. I didn't plan a specific trail. I just drove until I saw a dirt pull-off with a faded wooden sign that marked the start of an old trail. There were no cars there, which made me happy. I wanted quiet. The first part of the hike was peaceful. The trail was narrow, winding through pines and oaks, the ground soft with fallen needles and patches of dry leaves. The morning air was crisp, the kind that feels good to breathe in, cool enough that you don't sweat right away. I listened to the crunch of my boots, the distant caw of a crow, the soft tapping of a woodpecker somewhere higher in the forest. It was good. The trail climbed steadily, not too steep, but enough to work my legs. After an hour, I felt the burn in my thighs, and sweat dampened my shirt under the straps of my pack. I stopped at a rock outcrop and took a drink of water. Looking out, I could see the trees rolling like waves over the hills, endless green stretching until it blurred into the hazy line of the horizon. For a moment, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't felt in months. But as I pushed deeper into the forest, things started to change. The trail grew less clear, almost as if it hadn't been used in years. Bushes crowded the path, and downed branches forced me to step off to the side. I didn't mind at first. It felt more adventurous, less like some groomed tourist trail. I even liked that sense of being where few people had walked lately. But the further I went, the quieter it became. The usual forest sounds, the birds, the insects, even the breeze, seemed to fade. My footsteps grew louder because there was nothing to cover them. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I told myself it was just that I'd gone deeper, farther from roads and people, where animals stayed hidden. But even telling myself that, the silence felt heavy. After a while, I noticed something else. To my left, about 50 yards off the trail, I saw a tree that looked stripped bare on one side. The bark was clawed away in wide gouges, deep enough to show the pale wood underneath. They weren't small scratches from deer or little animals. These were large, vertical marks that stretched taller than me. I stopped and stared, trying to figure out what could have done it. A bear, maybe. That was the only thing that made sense. I had seen bear signs before, but never this close, never this fresh-looking. The edges of the wood were still raw, not darkened from weather. I felt uneasy but decided to keep walking. I had my knife, and I figured as long as I made noise, any bear would probably avoid me. So I tightened my straps and kept moving. The trail dipped into a hollow, where the trees grew closer, darker. The ground was soft with moss, and patches of mud sucked lightly at my boots. That's when I saw the first footprint. It wasn't a boot print. It was a paw, big and round, pressed into the mud so clearly that I could see the pads and claw marks. Fresh. The water inside the print was still clear, not filled with leaves or silt. My heart thudded harder. I slowed my pace, scanning the trees, every shadow suddenly sharp. I told myself it was fine. Bears roamed these woods. Seeing a track wasn't strange. But I couldn't shake the thought that the bear was nearby, maybe even watching. I picked up a stick and tapped it against trees as I went, trying to make noise without yelling. The trail wound uphill again, steeper this time until my calves burned. When I finally crested the rise, I found myself in a small clearing. The grass was flattened in places, pressed down in wide circles, as if something large had bedded there. I crouched, touching the ground. It wasn't old. The grass still held moisture where it had been crushed. I felt a shiver run through me. I had walked into the middle of a bear's resting place. I thought about turning back right then, but the idea of retracing the trail, passing those tracks and that stripped tree again, didn't feel much safer. I thought maybe if I pushed forward, I'd come out on a different road or trailhead. I convinced myself it was better to keep moving, so I did. The day stretched on. The sun moved west, the light slanting gold through the branches. I stopped for a quick snack, jerky and a granola bar, and kept walking. My water was running low, but I wasn't worried yet. I told myself I'd camp soon, find a spot to rest, and hike back in the morning. But then I realized I hadn't seen any trail markers in hours. No blazes on trees, no warn signs. The path itself was barely there now, more like a faint depression in the ground than a real trail. I kept losing it, backtracking to find it again. At one point, I lost it completely. I circled, trying to spot any sign, but everything looked the same. Trees, brush, rocks. The forest pressed in, endless in every direction. That's when the unease turned to something heavier, fear. I knew enough about hiking to stay calm. Panic makes you stupid. I forced myself to breathe, to sit on a rock and think. I still had daylight. I still had some food, some water, and gear. If I couldn't find the trail, I could camp, then retrace my way in the morning. But then I heard it. A sound behind me, heavy, deliberate. A crack of a branch under weight. Not a squirrel or a deer, something larger. I froze, my hand on the knife at my belt. My ears strained. Another step. Closer. Slow. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, just shadows and trunks. But I felt it, that prickling on the back of my neck when you know you're being watched. I stood, my heart hammering, and decided to move. Not run. That would be worse, but move steadily, keeping my eyes scanning behind me. The woods were too dense to see far. Every few steps I heard it again. A faint crunch, a brush of something against leaves. Always just behind me. I walked faster. The noise followed. By now the sun was dropping fast, the light thinning. The woods grew darker, colder. My chest tightened with each step. I couldn't see what followed me, but it was there. I felt it in my bones. I broke into a steady pace, half walk, half jog, ignoring the weight of my pack, ignoring the branches that whipped at my arms. My breaths grew harsh, loud in the silence. I stumbled once, nearly falling, and when I caught myself, I heard it again. Closer now, too close. The fear tipped over into something raw. I pulled the knife out, clutching it in my sweating hand. My legs burned, but I kept moving until I burst out into another small clearing. There, I dropped to my knees, gasping for breath, scanning the tree line. Nothing, just silence. But the silence was worse now. No birds, no insects, not even wind. Just me, kneeling in a dead quiet clearing, gripping a knife like it was the only thing keeping me alive. The last of the light faded. I knew I couldn't keep walking blind in the dark. I had to stop, even though every part of me screamed not to. I picked a spot against a thick tree and sat with my back to it, so nothing could come from behind. I didn't build a fire, I was too afraid of drawing attention. I sat in the dark, listening, the knife across my lap, my flashlight in my other hand. Hours passed like that. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart leap. Sometimes I thought I saw movement in the shadows between the trees, but when I shined the light, there was nothing. I didn't sleep, not once. By the time the first gray light of dawn came, I was shaking from exhaustion. I forced myself to stand, my legs stiff, and started walking again. I didn't know where I was going. I just kept moving, hoping I'd stumble onto a road or trail. And then, finally, after what felt like forever, I did. A dirt road, rutted and overgrown, but real. I nearly cried when I saw it. I followed it, limping, until I heard the faint hum of an engine. And then I saw a truck parked by a gate. When I stepped out, filthy and hollow-eyed, the man by the truck looked at me like I was half dead. He asked me something, but I just kept walking toward him, because all I knew was I was finally out. I never found out what followed me that night. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe it was a person. Maybe it was just my mind turning every noise into something worse. But I know what I felt, that steady presence behind me, tracking me step for step. I haven't hiked alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. I started that morning thinking it was just going to be another hike, another quiet day away from the noise of town. The air was still cool when I parked my car at the small dirt pull-off near the trailhead. The sun was only starting to warm the tops of the trees, and the gravel under my boots crunched with every step as I adjusted my backpack straps and made sure my water bottles were in place. The forest ahead of me looked deep, untouched, like a wall of green with only a narrow path leading inside. I had done a lot of hikes before, but this one was different. I picked it randomly. I hadn't researched much about it, hadn't checked trail reports or reviews. I just saw a thin line on a map app that showed a trail cutting across several miles of state forest and figured it would be a good way to kill a day. No one I knew had ever talked about hiking there, but the remoteness of it made me want to try. I thought it would be peaceful, quiet, maybe even refreshing. The first mile was easy, just dirt under my boots and the constant hum of insects. The trail wound between tall pines and oaks, their trunks damp with morning dew, their branches whispering whenever the wind moved through them. The smell of wet leaves and pine needles was strong, and now and then I'd pass through a patch of ferns that brushed against my legs. It felt like no one had been there for weeks, maybe longer. Spider webs crossed parts of the trail, clinging to my face when I walked through them. I noticed how narrow the path was compared to more popular hikes I'd done. It looked more like an animal track than something kept up for people. Rocks and roots stuck out in random places, and the earth was soft in spots where water must have run down from the hill above. I had to keep watching where I put my feet to avoid slipping. As I went deeper, the sounds of the road disappeared until all I could hear were birds calling from somewhere high up and the faint drip of water falling from leaves. The stillness was heavy, like the forest was swallowing every noise I made. After about an hour, I came to a split in the trail. There was no sign, no marker. One path continued straight, the other curved off to the left and looked less worn. I didn't think too much about it. I chose the straighter path, figuring it would keep me moving in the right direction. The further I went, the rougher the trail got. Branches lay across it, half rotted, and I had to step over or move around them. In some places the ground dipped, and I could see where rain had carved small gullies. I slipped once, catching myself on a tree before falling. My palms came away dirty, and I realized then how far I was from anyone who could help if something worse happened. 2 hours in, I still hadn't seen another person. Not a hiker, not even footprints. Usually on hikes, you notice signs of others, broken branches, shoe prints, maybe even trash left behind. But here, it was like I was walking somewhere forgotten. The trees grew denser, pressing in on both sides. The trail thinned even more until it was barely wider than my shoulders. Every so often, I would think about turning back, but I kept going. I told myself I could handle it, that I had enough water, food, and daylight to push further before heading out. That's when I noticed the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. No birds, no rustling. The kind of silence that makes your own breathing sound too loud. I stopped walking and just listened. Nothing moved. It was unsettling enough that I adjusted my pack and kept moving faster, telling myself it was nothing. The trail started climbing uphill. My legs burned as I pushed myself up, grabbing trees for balance. At the top, I expected a view or clearing, but instead I found something stranger. The path seemed to split again, only this time the new trail looked almost hidden, like it wasn't meant to be used. It cut sharply to the right and disappeared behind a cluster of rocks. I shouldn't have taken it. I know that now, but I was curious. The kind of curiosity that doesn't think about consequences. I stepped onto the hidden trail and followed it. This trail was different. It didn't look like it had been cut by people. It twisted, narrow, uneven, like an animal path. Branches hung low, scratching at my arms as I brushed past. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and fallen logs. My boots sank into soft soil in places where water must have collected. After 20 minutes of pushing through it, I realized I hadn't seen any trail markers. Not one. On normal hikes, you usually find paint blazes on trees, small signs nailed to trunks. Here, there was nothing, just endless trees. I told myself I'd turn back soon, but something about the trail kept pulling me forward. Maybe it was the idea that it led somewhere interesting. Maybe I just didn't want to admit I was lost already. Then I saw the first sign that something wasn't right. A tree stood off to the side with deep cuts in its bark, long vertical gouges, like something sharp had been dragged against it. They weren't from an axe, at least not any I'd seen. The cuts were uneven, almost frantic. I stopped and stared at them for a long time, then kept walking. Soon I started noticing more trees like that. Some had bark peeled off entirely in long strips. Others had holes that looked freshly dug into the wood. The deeper I went, the more of them I saw. My stomach sank with each one. I had no explanation for it. The air grew heavier. It smelled different too, damp but also sour, like rotting leaves mixed with something else I couldn't place. My shirt clung to me with sweat. I tried to steady my breathing, but I felt my chest tighten the further I went. Then I saw something lying on the ground ahead. At first I thought it was a fallen branch, but as I got closer, I froze. It was a boot, old, worn, half buried in dirt. It looked like it had been there for months, maybe longer. The laces were gone, the leather cracked. My first thought was that someone had lost it on the trail, but the way it sat there, alone, made my skin crawl. I picked it up and turned it over. The sole was coming apart, the inside filled with dirt and dead leaves. I set it back down and stood there, feeling uneasy in a way I couldn't shake. I thought about turning back again, but when I looked behind me, the trail was almost invisible. The branches I had pushed through closed back up. The ground looked the same in every direction. For the first time, I realized I might not be able to retrace my steps. I kept walking, slower now, paying attention to every sound. The silence was broken only by the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional snap of a twig. Every time I heard that, my heart jumped, because I couldn't tell if it was me or something else. I came across more things that didn't fit. A rusted metal can wedged into the roots of a tree. A piece of torn fabric hanging from a branch. Small things, but together they built a picture I didn't want to see. I started to feel watched. Every time I stopped, I swore I could hear faint movement behind me, like something shifting just out of sight. When I turned, there was nothing, just endless trees and shadows. I walked faster, almost jogging at times, my pack bouncing against my back. Sweat ran into my eyes, stinging them. My mouth was dry even though I had water. My whole body felt wired, tense, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. I came to a small clearing, and in the center of it was a fire pit. Not an old one, not collapsed and forgotten, but one that had been used recently. The stones around it were blackened, and inside was ash that hadn't been scattered by rain yet. Around it, the ground was trampled, flattened by feet. That's when the reality hit me. I wasn't alone. Someone had been out here, maybe still was. I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, scanning the trees, my skin prickling. No tents, no gear, no signs of people. Just that fire pit sitting there like a warning. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the tree line. Every instinct told me not to stay. I turned and walked back the way I thought I had come, but the trail twisted differently now. I couldn't tell if I was retracing my steps or heading deeper. My legs ached. My shoulders hurt from the weight of the pack. I drank water in quick gulps, but it didn't help. Hours seemed to pass, though I had no way of knowing. The light through the trees shifted, growing dimmer. Shadows stretched long across the ground. The forest didn't feel empty anymore. I couldn't see anyone, but the sense of being followed grew heavier with every step. Leaves rustled where I hadn't touched them. Branches snapped too far back to be me. I never saw who it was, never saw what it was, but I knew I wasn't alone. Not from the way the forest moved when I moved, not from the faint crunch of leaves that always matched my pace just a little too closely. By the time I finally stumbled onto a wider trail that looked familiar, the sun was already low. I don't remember how long I walked after that, only that every sound behind me felt like it was closing in. When I saw the faint glint of my car through the trees, relief almost dropped me to my knees. I ran the last stretch, fumbling for my keys, throwing my pack into the back seat without looking. I locked the doors as soon as I got inside and sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to steady my shaking hands. I drove away without looking in the mirror. I didn't want to see if anything stood at the tree line. I had planned this hike for weeks, maybe months if I really thought about it. I had been working too much, staring at screens, going through the same dull routine, and I felt like my body was starting to rot inside a chair. I wanted something raw, something that reminded me I was alive. So I picked a trail that wasn't popular, a trail that didn't show up on those lists of easy weekend hikes or family-friendly paths. This one was tucked away, a little line on an old map I had found online. Most people didn't go near it anymore because it wasn't marked well, and because it was long. That was exactly what I wanted. No crowds, no people, just me and the woods. I packed light but enough to get by. A sturdy backpack, sleeping bag, small tent, food that didn't spoil quick, a water filter, matches, flashlight, extra batteries, knife, first aid kit, and a map printed out just in case my phone lost signal. I left early in the morning, drove my car to the end of a dirt road that was more pothole than road, parked it by a patch of weeds, and locked it. I threw my bag over my shoulders, tightened the straps, and started walking. The air was cool and fresh at first, still heavy with the smell of wet leaves from the night rain. The trail was thin and almost hidden under the brush, but once I got on it, it was clear enough. I followed it as the trees grew taller and the light faded into a dim shade. The world outside was gone. It was just me, the dirt under my boots, the crunch of twigs, and the hollow silence of the woods. Hours passed slow. My legs burned from climbing up ridges and sliding down slopes. The ground was uneven, and at times the trail disappeared, forcing me to stop and scan for broken branches or patches of flattened grass that hinted where it continued. I liked it though. I liked that it wasn't easy. Every step felt like it mattered. I drank from streams, refilled my bottle with filtered water, and chewed on protein bars while leaning against trees. By late afternoon, I started thinking about where to set up camp. I didn't want to get stuck searching for a flat spot in the dark. I found a clearing not far from the trail, a patch of dirt surrounded by pines. The ground was soft with needles, and there was just enough space for my tent. I set it up, unrolled my sleeping bag inside, and gathered some sticks for a small fire. Soon I had flames licking at the wood, smoke rising in thin white streams. The heat felt good against the chill creeping in as the sun dropped. I ate some dried meat, stretched my legs, and listened to the forest hum with faint noises. Leaves shifting, something small scurrying through the underbrush, the occasional crack of a branch far away. As the sky turned dark, a kind of weight settled over the woods. The silence was different at night, heavier. It wasn't just quiet. It was thick, pressing against me like the air itself was watching. I kept the fire going longer than I needed, feeding it scraps of wood I had piled up. My flashlight was beside me, but I didn't want to use it. I didn't want that narrow beam cutting into the dark and showing me things I didn't want to see. The fire was enough. When I finally crawled into the tent, zipped it shut, and lay down, I felt my chest tighten. The sounds outside were clearer now that I wasn't moving. Every snap, every shuffle of leaves, every gust of wind against the fabric of the tent sounded like footsteps. I told myself it was animals, raccoons, maybe deer. The rational part of me believed that, but the rest of me, the part deep in my gut, kept waiting for something heavier to step closer. I didn't sleep well. I drifted in and out, waking to silence, then to faint scratching noises, then back to silence again. Morning came gray and slow. My body ached from the ground, but I packed up, ate quickly, and kept walking. The trail dipped into valleys, climbed rocky hills, and twisted through areas where the trees grew so close I had to push through branches. Hours went by without seeing anything but endless woods. It was peaceful, but it was also lonely in a way I hadn't felt before. A kind of loneliness that didn't feel like missing people, it felt like being forgotten by the world. By the third day, I noticed I was further in than I thought. My map was old, and the trail didn't always match it. Some parts were washed out, others blocked by fallen trees. I started cutting through off-trail areas to keep heading in the right direction, but that made me uneasy. Once you step off a trail, even a faint one, the forest changes. swallows you. I kept checking my compass and marking spots with broken sticks so I wouldn't circle back. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I was losing the thread of where I was. That evening, I found another spot to camp, this time near a ridge overlooking a hollow below. The land dipped steeply, the trees so thick down there I couldn't see the ground. It looked endless. I made a fire, but smaller this time, and sat watching the smoke climb into the night. I heard sounds from the hollow, faint but clear enough. Something moving, not small like a rabbit, but bigger, heavier. I froze, staring into the black tangle of trees, waiting. The noises came and went. Crack here, a rustle there, then silence. I tried to eat, but my stomach was tight. When I finally forced myself to crawl into the tent, my hands shook as I zipped it shut. I kept my knife close, the flashlight gripped in my hand, waiting for something to touch the walls of the tent. Nothing did, not that night. The next morning, I tried to push deeper, thinking I would find the end of the trail or some landmark that matched the map. But the deeper I went, the more it all looked the same. Every tree seemed like the last one, every hill a repeat of the one before. I tried to tell myself it was fine, that I could always retrace my steps. But when I turned back at one point, the way behind me didn't look like the way I came. The trail faded into patches of dirt and roots, and I realized I couldn't tell which direction was forward anymore. My chest tightened, sweat dripping down my back even though the air was cool. I forced myself to stay calm, pulled out my compass, and picked a steady direction. I told myself if I just kept moving straight, I'd hit something, a road, a river, something human. But hours turned into more hours and nothing came. The food in my pack was running low, and I felt every bite I took as a loss. My water filter worked fine, but finding streams wasn't always easy. My legs ached, my shoulders burned under the straps, and blisters tore at my feet. I kept walking because stopping felt worse. The woods grew stranger the deeper I went. Not magical or unreal, just heavier. The silence was thicker. The trees blocked more light even during the day. The air smelled damp, like rot, and the ground squished under my boots in places. I saw fewer signs of animals, fewer tracks, fewer sounds of birds. It was like even the wildlife didn't come this deep. And yet, at night, I still heard movements. Slow, deliberate movements just beyond the circle of my fire. Too heavy to be deer, too slow to be something small. Always keeping a distance but never leaving completely. By the 5th day, I stopped marking my path. It didn't matter anymore. I was lost and I knew it. My body was weaker. My mind stretched thin by the endless repetition of trees and dirt. I began to feel watched, not in the paranoid way but in the way that comes from real sounds. The crack of branches, the shuffle of leaves, the faint thud of steps that stopped when I stopped. I didn't see anyone, but I didn't need to. I knew I wasn't alone out there. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark, back against a tree, knife in my lap. The forest moved around me. Something shifted through the underbrush, closer than ever before. I held my breath, every muscle locked tight, waiting. The sound circled me, slow, like it was testing me, measuring me. Then it stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. I stayed awake until the first gray light crept through the trees. I don't know how many more days passed. Time blurred. My food ran out and I rationed what was left to crumbs. My body grew weak, dizzy spells hitting me as I stumbled forward. My lips cracked, my throat burned, even with water. I thought about turning back, but back didn't exist anymore. There was only forward, deeper into woods that never ended. Then one morning I broke through, not into a road or a town, but into a clearing with signs of people. Old, rotting wood from what looked like a collapsed cabin. Rusted metal scraps scattered in the dirt. Proof that someone had once been here, maybe years ago. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last. The place was abandoned, dead quiet, and I felt eyes on me again, stronger than ever. Whoever or whatever it was, they had followed me this far. I didn't stay long. I left the ruins and kept walking, but I knew then that I wasn't lost by accident. Something had been pushing me deeper, step by step, keeping me from leaving. Not by magic or force, but by watching, waiting, and making me afraid to turn back. I realized the danger wasn't the forest, it was whoever else was in it. I had been planning the hike for weeks, maybe even months if I was honest with myself. I had marked the trails, checked the elevation gain, and stocked up on everything I thought I would need. It wasn't my first time hiking alone, but I knew this trail would be the most demanding one I had ever tried. It was tucked away in a mountain range that people rarely visited, far enough from towns that there was no cell service, and long enough that if something went wrong, I'd have to depend on myself completely. That idea both excited me and filled me with a quiet unease that I kept ignoring. The day I started, the air was sharp with that clean mountain chill, the kind that makes your breath puff out like smoke even though the sun is up. I parked my car on the gravel pull-off near the faded wooden sign marking the start of the trail. The dirt lot was empty, and my car looked small and out of place against the towering dark green of the forest pressing in on all sides. I tightened the straps on my pack and tried not to focus on how quiet it was. No other cars, no other hikers, no distant voices. Just me, my boots, and the trail cutting into the trees. At first, the path was wide and steady, packed down by years of use, but as I moved further in, the trees grew thicker, swallowing the sun, and the ground became uneven. My boots crunched over old pine needles, small rocks, and branches. The deeper I went, the less I felt like I was in control of the space around me. The forest seemed to close its teeth around me, each step taking me further away from anything familiar. I tried to keep my mind calm, focusing on the rhythm of my steps and the swing of my arms, but my ears were always open. Every small sound stood out: the snap of a twig, the rush of wind through the high branches, the sudden burst of wings as a bird shot out of the brush. Each noise made me stop, made me turn my head, scanning the trees as if someone might be standing there. But it was always nothing, just the woods, just me. Hours passed and I lost track of time. The trail grew steeper as I climbed, my legs burning under the weight of the pack. I stopped often, hands on my knees, lungs pulling in cold air that tasted of dirt and moss. I drank from my bottle, the water lukewarm but refreshing, then pushed on. My shirt clung to my back with sweat, even though the forest around me felt damp and cool. As the trail wound higher, the ground changed from packed soil to loose rock, sharp and uneven. I had to watch my step carefully, planting my boots with purpose, gripping with my toes. The silence pressed heavier on me now. There were no bird calls anymore, no rustle of small animals in the brush. Just wind, only wind, sighing through the trees, low and constant, like breath on the back of my neck. The first sign of trouble came when I slipped. It wasn't much, just a loose stone rolling under my heel, but it sent me down hard onto my side. The weight of my pack dragged me, scraping my hip against the rock. I cursed under my breath, pushing myself up, brushing dirt from my hands. When I checked my hip, the skin was torn, blood rising in small dots. It wasn't bad, nothing that would stop me, but it reminded me how fragile everything was out here. One wrong move, one bad fall, and there would be no help. I told myself to be careful, to take it slower, but the trail only grew worse. It narrowed as I climbed, with one side pressed against the rock wall of the mountain and the other side dropping sharply into the trees far below. My pack scraped against stone, and I had to turn my body sideways at points to squeeze through. The higher I went, the more the forest below looked like a dark sea, endless and still. By the time the sun started dipping, the light fading into that dim blue that comes before night, I was exhausted. My legs trembled under me with each step, and my shoulders screamed from the straps digging in. I knew I had to stop soon. I found a small flat section off the trail where the trees opened just enough for a tent. It wasn't perfect. Roots twisted up from the ground, and rocks were scattered under the pine needles, but it was the best I could get. I dropped my pack and stretched out my aching arms, listening again. The silence was worse now, heavy, almost suffocating. I set up the tent quickly, hands fumbling from tiredness, then gathered a few sticks for a small fire. The wood was damp, and it took longer than I wanted to spark, but finally the flames caught, snapping and popping in the still air. I sat by the fire, eating a protein bar, the taste dry and bland in my mouth. I washed it down with a sip of water, my throat tight. As the sky turned black, the firelight pushed shadows into the trees. I tried to focus on the warmth, on the comfort of the flames, but my eyes kept drifting to the dark beyond. Shapes seemed to move just outside the glow, branches shifting in ways that didn't match the wind. My body stayed tense, every sound sharp in my ears. At one point, I thought I heard something heavy moving through the trees. A slow crunch of leaves, deliberate, steady. I froze, staring into the dark, but saw nothing. I told myself it was my imagination, the fire playing tricks, the forest alive in its own way. But I didn't believe it, not fully. I forced myself into the tent, zipping it shut, curling into my sleeping bag. I kept my knife close, the handle pressed against my palm, the blade hidden but ready. My eyes stayed open for a long time, staring at the thin fabric of the tent as the fire outside burned low. I waited for something. I didn't know what, but nothing came, at least not then. Morning was a relief. The forest was still, but the light broke the heaviness. I packed quickly, eager to move. My hip ached from the fall, my back stiff, but I pushed on. The trail rose higher and sharper, my boots slipping on loose gravel, my breath burning in my lungs. I felt smaller and smaller against the scale of the mountain, like the trees and rocks were pressing down on me, swallowing me whole. By midday, the weather turned. The clouds rolled in fast, thick and dark, swallowing the sun. The wind grew colder, harsher, cutting through my clothes. Then the rain came, sudden and heavy, soaking me within minutes. The trail became slick, mud sliding under my feet. I gripped branches and rocks to steady myself, my pack pulling me down with every stumble. I kept moving, knowing that stopping meant freezing. My teeth chattered, and my hands went numb. My boots squelched with water, each step heavier than the last. I looked for shelter, but the trail gave me nothing. Just trees, wet and black, their branches dripping. It was then I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought I imagined them, the rain distorting shapes in the mud. But as I crouched closer, I saw them clearly. Human footprints pressed deep into the wet trail. Bare feet. The toes were clear, the arches, the heel. No shoes, just skin against mud. And they were fresh. The rain hadn't filled them yet. My chest tightened. I looked behind me, scanning the trail I had come from, the trees standing silent on either side. Nothing. I looked forward, the prints winding up the path, disappearing into the trees ahead. I didn't want to follow them, but the trail left me no choice. I walked faster, my eyes darting to the trees, to every shadow. The prints continued, steady, always the same. Bare feet on sharp rock and mud. Who would walk this high, this deep, without shoes? Why? As the trail curved, I noticed something else. The prints veered off into the trees, away from the path. They cut sharply to the right, sinking into the brush, disappearing into the darkness between the trunks. I stopped, staring at the broken branches where something or someone had gone through. My heart pounded in my ears, and for a moment I couldn't move. The rain poured harder, running down my face, filling my mouth when I opened it to breathe. I forced myself to keep going, eyes forward, not daring to look into the trees. But the feeling grew heavier with each step. The sense that I wasn't alone, that something was there, just beyond sight, keeping pace with me. By the time night fell again, I was shaking from more than cold. I found another spot off the trail and set up camp as quickly as I could. My hands trembled so badly I could barely light the fire. The smoke curled weakly in the wet air, and the flames struggled against the damp. I sat close, my eyes wide, knife in my hand again. The forest seemed alive around me, every sound magnified. Branches cracked in the distance. Leaves rustled when there was no wind. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps circling just beyond the glow of the fire. Soft, careful, slow. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the tent with the knife gripped tight, my body rigid, waiting for the fabric to move, for the sound of breathing just outside. My mind played images of those bare feet, pressing into the mud, walking ahead of me, waiting. When morning came, the fire was dead, and I was exhausted. My body felt I had planned the hike for weeks, studying the maps late at night, tracing the thin lines of trails across the ridges, valleys, and switchbacks. I wanted something that felt remote, away from the noise of cars and people, somewhere that would force me to depend on myself and test how far I could push through discomfort. It was supposed to be a 3-day loop, about 30 miles in total, with sections that cut across ridges where cell service dropped away completely. That was the appeal. No buzzing notifications, no city hum, just me, the pack on my shoulders, and the quiet spread of forest and stone. I set out early, the morning air damp and cool, carrying the heavy smell of pine needles and soil. My pack bit into my shoulders almost right away, straps stiff from being cinched down, but I tried to ignore the discomfort and focus on the rhythm of my steps. The trail was narrow, just wide enough for boots, and climbed slowly through stands of fir and spruce. The air thinned as I climbed, and with every switchback the horizon widened. By mid-morning, the sun burned off the thin mist that clung low in the valley. I moved steadily, sweat dampening my back, taking quick sips from the water bladder as I followed the faded blazes marked on tree trunks. The first day was fine, long, tiring, but fine. My boots found their way across roots and rocks, and I stopped here and there to rest against fallen logs, letting the silence press around me. I ate cold tortillas stuffed with peanut butter, washed them down with gulps of lukewarm water, and pressed on. By late afternoon, I reached a high ridge. The wind was stronger there, colder, carrying the sharp scent of alpine air. The ground dropped away steeply on both sides, slopes scattered with broken stone, and I kept my steps measured, aware of how easy it would be to twist an ankle or worse. I pitched my tent in a small clearing a few miles beyond the ridge. The ground was uneven, scattered with pine cones, but I cleared a space and drove the stakes in deep. As the sun dropped, the air turned sharp, and I zipped myself into the sleeping bag early. The quiet was heavy, so total it made my ears ring. Every crack of a branch in the woods sent a jolt through me, but I reminded myself it was only wind, maybe deer moving through brush. Eventually, exhaustion smothered the restlessness, and I slept. The second day, I pushed deeper. The trail narrowed, more overgrown, the blazes harder to spot. Branches scratched across my arms, and thorny undergrowth snagged against my pants. I slowed often to check the map, aligning landmarks with the compass. Around midday, clouds began rolling in, thick and gray, cutting down visibility on the slopes. The forest seemed darker under them, and the temperature dropped fast. By the time I reached the valley floor, it was drizzling. My boots sank into wet earth, each step sucking mud around the soles. I pulled the rain cover over my pack and shoved my head down, focusing on moving forward. The trail became harder to follow, disappearing under patches of wet leaves and fallen branches. I paused often to study the ground, searching for the faint indentation of footsteps, the occasional blaze on a tree. That was when I noticed the first mistake. The map showed a clear junction near the creek, one path veering east toward the loop, the other cutting straight through toward a steep ridge. I should have hit it within an hour of dropping into the valley, but nothing came. The creek was there, swollen with rain, rushing brown and cold, but no junction. No blaze, just water roaring through slick rocks and moss. I stood in the drizzle, boots sinking deeper in mud, staring at the creek. Maybe I'd passed it already. Maybe the junction was further ahead. I felt that creeping unease, the kind that starts as a whisper but grows heavier the longer you ignore it. I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving along the water until I found the marked spot. But the marks never came. I hiked another hour, then two, following the creek until the valley tightened into a steep-walled gorge. The trees crowded in closer, branches hanging low, everything wet and glistening. The map made less sense the longer I stared at it, the lines not matching what my eyes saw. I pulled the compass out, aligning it with the edge of the map, but the heavy clouds made it harder to keep bearings. Every direction looked the same: gray sky, black trees, the glint of wet stone. I knew I had drifted off the main trail. The realization pressed into me like a weight. The valley wasn't supposed to narrow that way. The gorge wasn't on the map. I stood there for a long time, pack straps digging into my shoulders, drizzle soaking the brim of my cap, and tried to think through the panic starting to rise. Backtrack. That was the logical choice. Go back the way I came until I found the last blaze I remembered seeing. I turned around and retraced my steps, but the rain had blurred everything. Muddy tracks filled with water. Branches snapped back into place. The forest closed in, swallowing up any sign of where I had walked. I scanned tree trunks for blazes but found none. The panic grew teeth then. I forced myself to keep moving, each step heavier than the last. Hours bled together, and the rain never stopped. My clothes clung damp to my skin, chafing at the shoulders and thighs. My stomach growled, but the thought of stopping to eat made me feel exposed. The forest was too quiet now, the drizzle masking sounds, the air thick and cold. I wanted to believe I was circling back, that any moment the main trail would appear again, but it didn't. When the light began fading, I knew I was in trouble. I searched for a flat piece of ground, someplace not soaked with water, and set up the tent. The process felt clumsy with numb fingers, the stakes sliding loose in mud, the rain plastering hair to my forehead. When I finally crawled inside, water leaked along the seams, dripping onto the sleeping bag. I curled into myself, damp and shaking, trying to block out the sound of rain hammering against thin nylon. That night was endless. Every rustle outside felt close, too close. Branches scraped against the tent wall, and once, in the dead hours, I heard something heavier moving through the brush nearby. Slow, deliberate steps, then silence. My chest clenched, waiting for more, but nothing came. When dawn finally seeped gray into the sky, I packed up fast and forced myself back onto my feet. The rain had slowed but left the ground sodden, sucking at every step. My body ached, shoulders raw from the straps, legs heavy. I pushed uphill, hoping to climb out of the valley and find a landmark. The slope was brutal. Loose rocks slid under my boots, and branches clawed at me as I hauled myself upward. My breath came ragged, the air thin. I stopped often, bracing against trees, heart hammering. But higher ground was the only chance. Hours later, I reached a ridge. From there, the view spread in every direction. Endless waves of forest, broken by ridges and valleys, all blurred in mist. I turned in a slow circle, map in hand, trying to match shapes of land, but nothing lined up. I could have been anywhere. The panic returned full force. My throat tightened, stomach twisting, thoughts racing in sharp, jagged edges. I felt so small, so lost, swallowed by green and gray. The silence was crushing, the kind that pressed against your ears until you thought you might scream just to break it. I forced myself to sit, to breathe, to eat a few bites of trail mix even though it tasted like dust in my mouth. I needed a plan. Going further blindly would only bury me deeper. My best chance was to pick a direction, north, according to the compass, and follow it until I hit a road or another trail. The descent was worse than the climb. My legs shook with each step, boots slipping on wet stone, hands scraped raw from grabbing roots and branches. Twice I fell, slamming hard against the ground, once twisting my ankle so badly I thought I'd broken it. I lay there for a long moment, gasping, testing the joint. It held, though pain shot up my leg with every step afterward. By the time darkness fell again, I was barely moving. I pitched the tent on uneven ground, ate half a granola bar, and curled into the damp sleeping bag. My ankle throbbed. My body shook with exhaustion. My mind replayed every mistake, every wrong turn, every blaze I had failed to see. That night, sleep never really came. The forest groaned with wind, branches snapping, something distant crashing through undergrowth. My chest stayed tight, breath shallow. At one point, I realized I was whispering to myself, repeating over and over that I just had to keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. The third day blurred into survival. My ankle slowed me, each step agony, but I dragged myself north, clinging to the compass like it was the only thing tethering me to safety. Water was easy enough to find in streams, though I had to gamble on purity after my filter clogged with mud. Food ran low. My stomach knotted with hunger, and my hands shook when I tried to open the last